Hey, welcome back. If you're here settling in, getting comfortable, I'm really glad you found this. Tonight I want to take you somewhere a little different. Not a battlefield, not a royal court, not a war, just a kitchen, a medieval kitchen, cold stone walls of fire crackling low, and a woman standing over a barrel of salt pressing a slab of pork deep into the white crystals, with both hands, her knuckles going pale with the effort. She's not cooking dinner, she's buying time. And here is what I find quietly extraordinary about that image. She had no idea why it worked. She just knew it did. No science, no microbiology, no understanding of bacteria, of cells of the invisible world crawling across every surface of every piece of meat the moment it leaves the animal. She just knew because her mother knew and her mother's mother knew that salt and smoke and cold earth and certain mysterious liquids could hold death back for a little while longer. And honestly, that still gives me chills. So tonight we're going to spend some time with one of the most underrated stories in all of human history. Not the kings who conquered land, not the generals who changed borders. The quiet, unglamorous, absolutely essential story of how ordinary people kept food from killing them for 1,000 years before anyone ever thought to plug a metal box into a wall and call it progress. And I promise you, by the time we're done, you will look at your refrigerator differently, maybe even feel a little guilty about it. Just a little. Let me set the scene for you because I think context is everything. The Middle Ages, roughly from the 5th century all the way to the 15th, stretched across about 1,000 years of European history. 1,000 years. Think about that for a second. 1,000 years of winters with no canned soup, no frozen meals, no Uber Eats pulling up to the castle gate at 10 in the evening. 1,000 years of people waking up every single morning with the same quiet, urgent question pressing on their chest like a stone. Is there enough food? Will it last? What happens if it doesn't? Because this wasn't hypothetical anxiety. Famine in medieval Europe wasn't rare, it was a recurring, grinding, terrifying fact of life. Historians estimate that in France alone, major regional famines struck roughly every 15 to 20 years throughout the medieval period. In the 14th century, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, just a few years before the Black Death arrived to make everything catastrophically worse, killed somewhere between 10 and 25% of the population across parts of northern Europe. Let that number breathe for a moment. 10 to 25%. Not from plague, not from war, from hunger, from food that ran out or rotted or simply wasn't there. So when I say that food preservation was the most important technology in the medieval world, I mean that without any exaggeration at all. Salt was more valuable than iron. A well-stocked cellar could be the difference between a family surviving winter or not. And the men and women who truly mastered the art of keeping food alive through the cold months, they weren't alchemists or wizards. They were just paying very, very close attention. Now here's the thing I want you to sit with tonight, and this is what really hooked me when I first started going down this rabbit hole. We tend to romanticize the medieval period in one of two ways. Either we see it as this grim, grey, plague-ridden horror, people living in mud, dying young, not knowing anything about anything. Or we swing the other direction and make it all flowing gowns and feasts and noble knights doing noble things. And the truth is so much more interesting than either of those pictures. Because what the historical record actually shows us in household account books, in estate records, in monastery inventories, in the practical manuals that wealthy households kept, is that medieval people had systems. Sophisticated, layered, carefully thought out systems for keeping food alive. They observed the natural world with an intensity that most of us have completely lost touch with. They knew which direction the wind came from in autumn. They knew which stone cellars stayed coolest in summer. They knew through generations of hard-won knowledge exactly how much salt per pound of pork would get you through to February without making the meat so aggressively salty it was basically inedible. Which, by the way, was apparently a real problem. Medieval cookbooks, and yes, they existed, which is another thing that surprises people. Medieval cookbooks from the 13th and 14th centuries repeatedly warn cooks about oversalting preserved meats. Some recipes specifically instruct the cook to soak heavily salted meat in fresh water before cooking just to pull some of the salt back out. That detail makes me smile every time I think about it, because it means that somewhere around the year 1250 some very tired cook was standing over a pot of brutally salty pork going, right, we're going to have to sort this out. Again. Universal human experience across 800 years. But before we get deep into the individual methods, the salt, the smoke, the strange magic of fermentation, the underground kingdoms of cold stone, I want to make sure we understand something fundamental, something that shapes everything about how medieval people thought about food and time and survival. They had no concept of refrigeration. I know that sounds obvious, but I want you to really feel it for a moment. Not just they didn't have fridges, because we all know that intellectually. I mean, they had no mental model, no framework, no working understanding of the idea that slowing things down with cold could preserve food indefinitely. The Roman Empire had used snow and ice for luxury cooling packed into underground rooms called specularia for the very wealthy, but that knowledge largely dissolved with the empire, and it didn't really resurface at scale until much later in the medieval period, and even then only for the elite. For most medieval people, most of the time, the question was never, how do I keep this cold? The question was, how do I transform this food into something that death cannot touch? And that shift in framing from refrigeration to transformation is what produced all of the most fascinating preservation methods of the era. Because they weren't trying to pause food in time, they were trying to change it, to convert it into something fundamentally different, something that bacteria couldn't use, couldn't feed on, couldn't destroy. And in doing so, almost by accident, they invented flavors and textures and entire culinary traditions that we still celebrate today. Prosciutto, aged cheddar, sourdough bread, sauerkraut, salted cod, smoked salmon. Every single one of those things exists because someone somewhere in medieval Europe or even earlier was desperately trying to solve a survival problem, and the solution turned out to be delicious. I find that genuinely beautiful. The idea that beauty can come from desperation, that some of the most beloved flavors in human civilization were born not from creativity or abundance, but from fear. From the fear of an empty larder in January, from the fear of a long winter with hungry children, from the absolutely fundamental, deeply human drive to look at what you have and make it last. Now, over the course of our time together tonight and for the next several evenings, because there is genuinely so much to explore here, we're going to walk through 12 different chapters of this story. We're going to talk about salt not just as a seasoning, but as a social hierarchy, a currency, and a weapon against time. We're going to talk about smoke and fire and why medieval people were, without knowing it, creating natural antibiotics in their chimneys every autumn. We're going to go underground into the cold cellars and storage pits where food was hidden from the sun and the warmth and the relentless creep of decay. We're going to talk about fermentation, that strange, beautiful process where controlled rot becomes preservation. We're going to talk about honey and fat and wax and the almost alchemical ways that medieval cooks used them to seal food away from time itself. We're going to talk about monks who quite accidentally became the world's first food scientists while simply trying to feed their communities through long winters. And we're going to talk about the spice trade and why the desire to preserve food didn't just shape what people ate, it shaped the entire map of the world. And yes, we're going to talk about the things that went wrong, because they went very wrong sometimes. And the stories of medieval food poisoning of whole villages losing their minds from contaminated grain, those stories are not just dark curiosities. They're reminders of how much these people were genuinely wagering every time they opened a barrel or broke the seal on a crock. Every meal was in some quiet way an act of faith, but for right now tonight I just want you to breathe. Let go of the day, and start to imagine a world where keeping food alive was the most important thing you did. Not a burden exactly, more like a conversation. A long, careful, daily conversation between human beings and the natural forces that were always trying to undo what they had built. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that I come back to again and again whenever I think about this period, is that they won that conversation. Not perfectly, not always, but often enough and cleverly enough to feed civilizations, build empires, fund wars, stock monasteries, fill market halls, and eventually pass that knowledge down through so many generations that fragments of it are still sitting in your kitchen right now. That jar of pickles in your fridge, that smoked salmon on your bagel, that sourdough starter on someone's counter still bubbling away, descended from wild yeast that medieval bakers first coaxed out of the air centuries ago. We think we invented all of this. We didn't. We just forgot who taught us. So now that you understand why this obsession ran so deep, why a barrel of salt was more precious than most people's annual wages, and why a properly stocked root cellar was the difference between comfort and catastrophe, I want to start pulling back the curtain on how they actually did it. And we begin, as all the great medieval stories do, with something simple, something ancient, something so ordinary we sprinkle it over our eggs without a second thought, something that for 1,000 years held the line between life and ruin. And the story of how it did that and what it cost and what it meant and why sitting above it at a royal dinner table was one of the highest honours a medieval nobleman could receive, that story is coming up right now. Salt. Just say that word slowly for a second. Salt. It is so ordinary to us now that we barely register it. It sits in a little shaker on the kitchen table. We knock it over accidentally and then, depending on how superstitious we are, maybe toss a pinch over our left shoulder for good luck. We do not think about it. We do not worry about it. And that right there, that complete and total indifference to salt is one of the clearest signs of just how far removed we are from the world we're about to step into. Because in medieval Europe, salt was not a condiment. Salt was power. Let me give you a number that I think will reframe everything. In 13th century England, a labouring peasant might earn somewhere around 1 penny a day for a full day's work in the fields. A bushel of good quality salt, roughly the amount a household might need to preserve their autumn slaughter of a single pig, could cost several days' wages. Several days. For something we now buy in a cardboard cylinder for less than $1. And that pig wasn't just dinner. That pig was the family's entire protein supply for the winter. Every scrap of it needed to be salted correctly, stored correctly, and rationed carefully across months of cold. Get the salt wrong too little, and the meat rotted anyway. Too much, and it became nearly inedible, so brutally saline that even cooking couldn't fully rescue it. And this is something I think about a lot when people romanticize the simplicity of medieval life. There's nothing simple about it. Every decision about food was a calculation, a gamble, a negotiation between what you had and what you needed and what nature was going to do to it in the meantime. So where did all this salt come from? This is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because the geography of salt in medieval Europe was not random. It had shape. The most prized salt came from salt pans along the Atlantic coast, places like the Bay of Biscay in what is now France and Spain, where shallow coastal lagoons allowed seawater to evaporate slowly in the sun, leaving behind thick crystalline deposits. This bay salt, as it was commonly called, was harvested in enormous quantities and shipped northward up through the English Channel into the North Sea, reaching markets in England, Scandinavia, the Baltic states, and as far east as Poland and Russia. And here is a detail I find quietly extraordinary. The salt trade was so fundamental to medieval commerce that it essentially created the infrastructure of northern European trade. The routes that ships travelled to carry salt north in autumn were the same routes that came back loaded with timber furs, grain and fish. The Hanseatic League, that powerful alliance of northern German trading cities that dominated Baltic commerce for nearly 3 centuries, built much of its wealth on the simple fact that it controlled the distribution of salt to the fishing communities of Scandinavia and the Baltic coast. Without salt to preserve the herring catch, there was no herring trade. Without herring trade, there was no Hanseatic League. Without the Hanseatic League, the entire economic geography of medieval northern Europe looks completely different. All of that tracing back to a mineral you knocked off your breakfast table this morning. Now here's where I want to slow down, because I think this is the part that most people miss when they talk about salt and medieval preservation. We tend to think of salting as one thing you rub salt on food and it doesn't go bad. But medieval salt preservation was actually a remarkably sophisticated spectrum of techniques. On one end, you had dry salting, the most direct approach. You pack the meat or fish in dry salt crystals, either rubbing them in firmly by hand or burying the food completely in a barrel of salt. The salt draws moisture out of the flesh through a process we now call osmosis, though obviously medieval practitioners had no such word for it. They just knew it worked. The liquid that leached out a brine of water and salt and meat proteins would pool at the bottom of the barrel. Sometimes it was drained. Sometimes it was left because that brine itself became a secondary preservation environment. Which brings us to the other end of the spectrum, wet brining or brine curing. Here the food was submerged in a prepared saltwater solution, sometimes with herbs, sometimes with a little vinegar, sometimes with other spices added for flavour and additional preservation. The ratio of salt to water was critical. Too weak a brine and bacteria could still survive in it. Too strong and the food became almost impossibly salty. Medieval cooks developed these ratios through pure empirical observation, through watching, tasting, comparing over many generations. There was no chemistry degree involved, just patience and attention, and the particular kind of intelligence that comes from having very high stakes. And then there was the question of which salt. Because here's something that genuinely surprises most people. Not all salt was created equal in the medieval world, and the differences mattered enormously, not just for preservation but for social status. Fine white salt, the kind that had been carefully evaporated and refined, free of the grey and brown minerals that contaminated cheaper varieties, was expensive. Extraordinarily so. Coarse sea salt, what the records call bay salt, was cheaper, heavier, less refined, and worked perfectly well for industrial preservation, packing barrels of fish or curing large cuts of meat. But at the tables of the wealthy, the nobility, the clergy of high rank, you served fine salt, and not just in any container. The salt cellar, the vessel that held this precious white mineral, was one of the most elaborately crafted objects on a medieval dining table. Wealthy households commissioned salt cellars of silver, of gilt bronze, of carved ivory. They were often the centerpiece of the table, and this is where we get one of my favorite little windows into medieval social psychology. Guests who were seated above the salt cellar, that is between the salt and the host at the head of the table, were people of high standing. Important people. People the host wished to honour. Guests seated below the salt further down the table on the far side from the host were of lower rank. They might still be welcome. They might still eat well. But the message was clear, and everyone in that room understood it without a word being spoken. You were above the salt, or you were not. The next time someone tells you table manners are superficial, I want you to remember that. A mineral used to stop meat from rotting also became the physical measurement of social worth at the grandest tables in Europe. I have to pause here and be honest with you about something because I think it adds a layer to this story that often gets skipped over. Salt preservation was not comfortable. The meat that came out of those barrels in February, the salted pork that a family had been rationing since November, was often by modern standards extremely unpleasant. It was dense, sometimes grey or slightly brown rather than pink, chewy in ways that fresh meat is not, and the flavour could be almost overwhelming, sharp, mineral-heavy, deeply savoury in a way that could cross the line into aggressive if you weren't careful. Medieval cookbooks, the ones that have survived from the 13th and 14th centuries onward, are filled with instructions for managing this problem. Soaking the meat overnight in fresh water, changing the water multiple times, cooking it slowly with aromatics to soften the salt and coax back some of the original flavour. One detail in particular stays with me from historical food research instructions for soaking salt cod dried and salted fish, which we'll get to in more detail in a later chapter, could involve soaking for up to 48 hours with multiple water changes before the fish was even close to edible. 48 hours of soaking before you could even begin cooking dinner, and people did this every week without complaint, because the alternative, no protein at all in the depths of winter, was so much worse. There is also a dimension to salt preservation that I think often goes completely unexamined, and it's this: salt was unequally distributed, and that inequality shaped who survived and who didn't, in ways that were quiet and invisible and devastating. Peasant households used coarser, cheaper salt in larger quantities, heavy, bringing aggressive preservation. The food that came out of those barrels was often harsher, saltier, less refined. Wealthy households could afford finer salts, better ratios, more careful techniques. They had servants to manage the process properly. They had large stone cellars with consistent cool temperatures that helped the brining work more evenly. And then there were communities, particularly in inland areas far from the coast, far from the major salt trade routes, where good preserving salt was genuinely difficult to obtain at any price. These communities developed their own workarounds, smoking more heavily using fermentation as their primary preservation strategy, drying food in ways that required less salt. We'll talk about those methods in the chapters ahead. But I want you to hold this thought for now. The geography of salt access in medieval Europe was in a very real sense the geography of nutritional survival. Where the salt routes ran, people ate better in winter. Where they didn't, winters were harder, food was scarcer, and the margin between enough and not enough was razor thin. Now I promised you a story about salt that goes beyond the barrels and the brines, and here it is. In medieval England, salt production was so strategically important that the Crown actively managed it. The Domesday Book, that extraordinary survey of English landholding commissioned by William I in 1086, records hundreds of salt-producing locations called saltons, distributed across coastal and inland brine spring areas. These weren't just noted for curiosity. They were catalogued because they were assets, taxable, controllable, militarily significant assets. To control the salt supply was to hold something close to control over the food security of the entire kingdom. And this logic wasn't unique to England. In France, the gabelle, a royal tax on salt, became one of the most hated levies in French history. It persisted for centuries. It was deeply unequal, different regions paid wildly different rates, and certain privileged groups were exempt while ordinary people were not. And historians will tell you quietly, carefully, that resentment over the gabelle was one of the many threads woven into the fabric of the French Revolution. Salt taxes, contributing to the revolution that changed the modern world. If that's not the most improbable sentence you've heard all evening, I don't know what is. But here is the thing about salt that I keep coming back to. The thing that makes me genuinely emotional about this particular chapter of the story, Medieval people used salt not just to preserve food, they used it to preserve time. What they were doing when they packed that pork into a barrel in November, when they rubbed salt crystals into a ham with cold, tired hands, when they lowered a crock of brined vegetables into the cellar floor, was making a bet on the future. They were saying, we will still be here in February. We will still need to eat in March. We're going to survive this winter. That barrel of salt, in a very real sense, was an act of hope. Not optimism, medieval people were far too practical for easy optimism, but hope. The particular kind of hope that requires work and patience and skill and the willingness to plan for a future you cannot see clearly. And there is something about that, something I find deeply moving even now, that connects us to those people across 1,000 years of distance. We still salt things. We still cure meat brine vegetables, season food with that same ancient white mineral. We do it mindlessly now, without a thought for what it once cost or what it once meant. But somewhere in the muscle memory of human civilization, the knowledge is still there. And now, because I don't want to let you get too comfortable, I want to tell you about the other method that ran alongside salt through every autumn in medieval Europe. The one that didn't just preserve food, the one that changed it, that filled the air of every farmyard and every manor hall with a thick, sweet, ancient smell that medieval people associated with safety, with warmth, with the particular comfort of knowing that winter at least would not come for them entirely unprepared. Smoke, fire, and the remarkable unlikely science of how hanging meat over a smouldering fire in a world that had never heard the word bacteria somehow managed to accomplish exactly what modern food scientists now tell us it was doing all along. Close your eyes for just a second. Imagine it's October, somewhere in the English countryside around the year 1200. The air has that particular sharpness to it, the kind that gets into your lungs and reminds you very quietly that the warm months are done. The harvest is in. The last of the root vegetables have been pulled from the earth, and now in farmyards and manor courtyards and monastery outbuildings all across northern Europe, something is happening that has been happening every single autumn for longer than anyone can remember. Fires are being lit, not cooking fires, not warming fires. Long, slow, smouldering fires fed with carefully chosen wood kept deliberately low, allowed to breathe just enough to produce thick rolling clouds of smoke rather than clean open flame. And above those fires, hanging from wooden beams and iron hooks and rough rope, are the pieces of meat and fish that a family, a community, a lord's household is counting on to survive the next 4 months. The smoke rises. It coils around the flesh. It seeps into every fibre, every surface, every tiny crevice. And somehow, in a way that nobody in that farmyard could explain in scientific terms, but that everyone understood instinctively, the meat begins to change. It darkens. It firms. It develops a depth of flavour that raw salted meat simply does not have. And crucially, it lasts. Now I want to ask you something. Have you ever actually thought about why smoke preserves food? I mean really thought about it. Not just accepted it as a fact, the way we accept that the sun rises in the east, or that gravity pulls things downward. Because the answer, when you dig into it, is one of those beautiful moments where medieval practical knowledge turns out to be doing something extraordinarily sophisticated without having any idea that it was. Here is what is actually happening when smoke penetrates meat. Wood smoke is not just smoke. It is a complex chemical cocktail, a mixture of hundreds of different compounds released as the wood slowly combusts. And among those compounds are several that we now know have powerful antimicrobial properties. Phenols, formaldehyde. Yes, that formaldehyde, though, in concentrations far too low to be harmful to humans at normal exposure. Acetic acid, creosote compounds. These substances, when they settle onto the surface of meat or fish, do several things simultaneously. They create a physical barrier, a thin, slightly hardened outer layer that slows the penetration of moisture and airborne bacteria. They inhibit the growth of the specific microorganisms most responsible for meat spoilage, and they lower the water activity of the surface tissue, which is essentially the same mechanism that salt uses, but achieved through a completely different pathway. Medieval people did not know any of this. They had no concept of phenols. They had never heard of microorganisms. Germ theory wouldn't arrive for another 600 years. But they knew with absolute certainty, passed down through generations of careful observation, that meat hung over smoke lasted longer than meat that wasn't. And so they built smokehouses. They developed techniques. They argued, I have no doubt, about which would produce the best smoke for which purpose. Because it turns out, and this is something that modern food scientists have confirmed, it absolutely does matter. Different woods produce smoke with meaningfully different chemical profiles. Hardwoods, oak, beech, apple, cherry burn slowly and produce dense, complex smoke that penetrates deeply and adds rich, layered flavor. Softwoods like pine and spruce were generally avoided for smoking food, not just because of flavor, but because they produce higher concentrations of certain compounds that at heavy exposure can be genuinely unpleasant. Medieval smokehouse operators, and by operators, I mean farmwives, servants, monks, manor cooks, developed strong regional preferences for specific woods that were entirely based on practical experience. In parts of England and northern France, oak was the wood of choice. In Scandinavia, birch and alder were common. In parts of Germany, beechwood smoking became so associated with local food traditions that specific regional variants of smoked sausage and ham still carry those same wood signatures today. These are not coincidences. These are the fingerprints of 1,000 years of empirical refinement, of people paying attention, of people caring enough about the outcome to remember what their grandmother used and her grandmother before her. But here is where I want to go a little deeper, because the story of medieval smoking is not just about farmhouses and preserved meat. It is also about fish, and specifically it is about one fish that I would argue changed the economic destiny of an entire civilization: the herring. Small, oily, abundant in the North Sea and Baltic waters, the herring was one of the most important food sources in all of medieval northern Europe. And crucially, it was one of the most perishable. Fresh herring begins to deteriorate almost immediately after being pulled from the water. It is rich in the oils that make it nutritious, but those same oils oxidize rapidly, turning the flesh rancid within hours in warm weather. Without preservation, herring could only feed the communities immediately adjacent to the fishing grounds. With smoking and with salting, which worked in combination, herring became something else entirely. It became a commodity. Smoked and salted herring, known in England as kippers, when split and cold smoked, or red herrings, when heavily smoked until deeply coloured and intensely flavoured, could survive weeks or months of travel. And this changed everything. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the preserved herring trade was one of the most significant commercial operations in northern Europe. The annual herring fair at Great Yarmouth on the English coast drew merchants from across the continent. Barrels of smoked and salted herring travelled through trade networks stretching from England to Poland, from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean. There is a detail in the historical record that I find almost poetic. Kippers, smoked herring from the North Sea coast, were documented in market records as far away as Constantinople. Constantinople, which is, to be clear, roughly 2,000 miles from the North Sea. A little smoked fish packed in a barrel travelling 2,000 miles to feed someone at the edge of the Byzantine world. All because someone learned to hang fish over a fire at the right temperature with the right wood for the right amount of time. Now, I want to be honest about something here, because I think history deserves that honesty. Smoking was not a perfect technology. It worked remarkably well by the standards of what was available, but it had limits, and medieval people knew those limits intimately. The preservative effect of smoke was primarily a surface phenomenon. The outer layers of the meat received the most protection. Deeper into a thick cut, the penetration of smoke compounds was limited. This meant that for larger pieces of meat, whole legs of pork, large sides of beef smoking alone was rarely sufficient. It almost always needed to be combined with salting, which worked from the inside out as the salt drew moisture from the deeper tissues. The combination of salt and smoke together was in practice dramatically more effective than either method alone, and medieval practitioners figured this out through trial and error long before anyone could have articulated why it worked. The sequence was typically salt first to begin drawing moisture and create a partial barrier against spoilage, then smoke to harden and protect the surface, and add that additional layer of antimicrobial chemistry. The specific timing varied. Different households, different regions, different traditions had their own approaches, some salting for days before smoking, some doing both simultaneously, some alternating between the two. What they all shared was the underlying logic, even if they'd have described it in completely different terms than I just did. There is also a dimension to smoking that I think deserves its own moment, because it tends to get overlooked in the purely practical conversation. Smoke was sacred. I don't mean that in a vague metaphorical way. I mean that in many medieval communities, particularly in the folk traditions of rural northern Europe, the smoke that rose from a hearth or a smokehouse carried genuine spiritual significance. Fire was life. The hearth fire was the centre of the household, sometimes literally never allowed to go out from one generation to the next, and smoke, the visible breath of fire, was seen as a purifying force, something that drove away illness, bad spirits, and the invisible corruptions that turned good food to rot. Medieval people didn't have the vocabulary of microbiology, but they had observed correctly that things hung in smoke didn't decay the way other things did, and in a world where the explanation for why anything happened was usually theological or supernatural, the conclusion was almost inevitable. Smoke cleanses. Smoke protects. Fire is a gift that keeps things whole. I find that beautiful in the way that a lot of medieval thinking is beautiful, not because it was scientifically accurate, but because it arrived at a true observation through a completely different pathway. The fire did protect them. The smoke did cleanse the meat in its own chemical way. They were right. They were just right for reasons they couldn't have imagined. Let me give you one more specific detail before we move on, because I think it grounds this whole chapter in something real and tangible. Stockfish. If there is a single preserved food that defines the ambition and the sheer stubbornness of medieval food preservation, it is stockfish. Stockfish is cod. Split down the middle, fixed to a wooden rack or a pole, and then left outside in the cold, dry, wind-swept air of the Norwegian coast for several months. No salt, no smoke, just wind and cold. The result is a piece of fish so thoroughly desiccated that it becomes hard as wood, literally. There are historical accounts of it being struck with mallets to break it apart before it could be cooked. You had to soak it sometimes for days before it softened enough to eat. And yet stockfish was one of the most widely traded food commodities in all of medieval Europe, because it lasted essentially indefinitely if kept dry. A barrel of stockfish on a ship could feed a crew for months. It could be stored in a warehouse for years. It could travel to markets that fresh or even smoked fish could never reach. The Norwegian coastline, particularly the Lofoten Islands, became one of the most economically important food production regions in medieval Europe, almost entirely on the basis of stockfish. The cold, dry Arctic wind did what no other technology could do. It removed moisture so completely, so relentlessly, that bacteria simply had nothing to work with. Nature itself was the preservation method. And medieval Norwegians, to their extraordinary credit, looked at their brutal climate and thought, we're going to use this, not survive despite it, use it, which brings me to something I think about a lot. We have this tendency, and I catch myself doing it too, to feel a little sorry for people in the past, to imagine their lives as smaller, harder, more limited than ours, and there were absolutely ways in which they were harder. I won't pretend otherwise, but when I look at the sophistication of a medieval smoking and drying, at the way these communities read their climate, their landscape, their available resources, and built entire food systems around what their environment could offer, I don't feel sorry for them. I feel something closer to admiration, and maybe, if I'm being really honest, a little bit of humility, because these people were solving with no scientific instruments and no formal education the same fundamental problem that food scientists spend careers studying today. How do you keep biological material from breaking down? They didn't know the question in those terms, but they found the answer. Over and over again, in different climates and with different materials and through different traditions, they found it, and they passed it forward. Now, we've talked about salt drawing moisture out from the inside. We've talked about smoke building a chemical fortress on the outside, but both of those methods, for all their power, worked primarily on surface, on the external conditions of the food. There was another approach that medieval people used, one that worked on a completely different principle, one that didn't fight decay from the outside, one that didn't try to remove moisture or kill bacteria at the surface. Instead, it went underground, literally. And the cold, dark, quiet world beneath the earth, the cellars and pits and stone chambers that medieval communities built and relied on, turns out to be one of the most elegant food preservation systems ever conceived. Not because anyone designed it that way, but because the earth itself at the right depth maintains almost exactly the right temperature, year-round, without any energy input, without any maintenance, just physics. And the story of how medieval people discovered that and built around it, and how profoundly it shaped everything from peasant survival to the architecture of great manor houses, that is what we're stepping into right now. There is something about going underground that has always made humans feel a certain way, a little uneasy maybe, a little primal, the darkness, the quiet, the way the temperature drops almost immediately as you descend the first few steps below the surface. And yet for the better part of 1,000 years that uneasiness was completely beside the point, because underground was where the food lived. Underground was where families kept the things they could not afford to lose, and the people who understood the earth beneath their feet, who paid attention to its rhythms, its temperatures, its moods across the seasons, those people ate in February when others didn't. Let me paint you a picture. It is midsummer, somewhere in rural England around the year 1300. Above ground, the sun is relentless. The air shimmers over the fields. Flies cluster on anything that isn't moving fast enough to discourage them. And yet, if you were to descend into the root cellar dug beneath an ordinary farmhouse, down a narrow set of stone steps through a heavy wooden door, you would feel it immediately. Cool air. Not cold exactly, not uncomfortably so, but a steady, reliable coolness that has nothing to do with the season above. Roughly 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round. In summer, that is a refrigerator. In winter, it is just above freezing, cool enough to slow decay dramatically, but not so cold that root vegetables freeze and turn to mush. And this temperature stability, this remarkable consistency, was not something medieval people engineered deliberately in the sense of calculating soil thermal properties. They discovered it by digging, by noticing that the earth at a certain depth simply held. It kept a temperature that neither summer heat nor winter cold could fully penetrate, and once they noticed, they built around it. The physics behind this is genuinely elegant, and I want to take a moment with it because I think it makes the whole thing more wonderful, not less. The Earth's surface temperature fluctuates dramatically with the seasons baking in summer, freezing in winter, with swings of sometimes 60 or 70 degrees Fahrenheit between the extremes. But soil is an insulator, and as you go deeper, the soil buffers those surface fluctuations more and more effectively. At roughly 4 to 6 feet below the surface, depending on latitude and local soil composition, the temperature stabilizes at something close to the average annual temperature of that location. In most of temperate northern and western Europe, that average annual temperature sits in the range of approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which happens to be quite by coincidence almost exactly the temperature range that modern food scientists identify as optimal for storing root vegetables, cured meats, hard cheeses, preserved fruits, and fermented beverages. Medieval people did not know they were operating in an optimal temperature range. They just knew that food kept down there, and food didn't keep up here. That was enough. Now, what I find genuinely fascinating, and what I think tends to get glossed over in most tellings of this story, is how remarkably varied medieval underground storage actually was. We tend to imagine a single thing when we hear root cellar, a hole in the ground, maybe with some shelves, turnips, potatoes, basic. But the reality across medieval Europe was a spectrum of sophistication that ranged from that simple pit to some genuinely impressive architectural achievements. At the most basic level, you had what historians sometimes call clamp storage, essentially a pile of root vegetables, usually turnips, parsnips, or carrots, covered with a layer of straw for insulation, and then a layer of soil over the top. No construction required, no tools beyond a spade. Just the understanding that burying your harvest under enough earth would keep it alive through winter. This was accessible to almost anyone. Even the poorest peasant household could do this, and it worked. Not perfectly, there was always some loss to rot at the edges of the pile where the insulation was thinner, but enough of the harvest would survive to matter. Then, moving up the complexity scale, you had dug cellars, actual excavated chambers lined with stone or timber to prevent the walls from collapsing inward, accessed by steps or a ladder often built directly beneath or adjacent to the main living structure. These were more expensive to build and required real skill to construct properly, but they were also dramatically more effective. The stone lining helped regulate humidity, which is actually just as important as temperature for food storage. Too dry and root vegetables shriveled and lost nutrition. Too damp and mould spread rapidly through everything. The right stone local limestone was particularly valued for this purpose in parts of England and France, created an environment that balanced these competing needs in a way that bare earth walls could not. And then at the highest end of the spectrum there were the great cellars of medieval estates and monasteries. These were not simple storage holes, these were designed spaces, vaulted stone ceilings that distributed weight evenly and resisted collapse. Thick walls, sometimes 3 or 4 feet of solid masonry that provided extraordinary thermal insulation. Multiple chambers for different storage purposes because the medieval food manager understood that different foods had different needs. A well-designed large cellar might have separate areas for wine and ale, where slightly different humidity and temperature conditions were preferred, separate sections for root vegetables, for cured meats, for cheese. Some even had channels built into the floor to manage drainage because condensation was a constant challenge, and pooling water at the base of stored food barrels was an invitation to exactly the kind of mold and rot you were trying to prevent. Think about that level of practical engineering. No formal architectural training, no textbooks, no engineering degree, just generations of accumulated knowledge about what worked and what didn't, encoded in the hands and memories of the people who built and maintained these spaces. I want to tell you about a specific place because I think it makes all of this concrete in a way that statistics and generalities can't quite achieve. Chateau Gaillard, a castle built by Richard I of England, Richard the Lionheart on a dramatic cliff above the Seine River in Normandy, completed around the year 1198. Richard built it in an almost impossibly short time, roughly 2 years, which for a fortification of that scale was astonishing, and the historical record suggests he was obsessive about its design. Now, Chateau Gaillard is usually discussed in terms of its military architecture, its concentric walls, its strategic position, the famous siege it endured in 1203 and 1204. But what tends to get far less attention is the infrastructure built into its lower levels, storage chambers, extensive, carefully planned underground and semi-underground storage spaces designed to allow the castle garrison to withstand a prolonged siege, because a castle ultimately is only as strong as its food supply. No walls are thick enough to protect you from starvation, and the great castle builders of the medieval period understood this with absolute clarity. The design of the storage levels, the positioning relative to the cliff face to maximize natural cool air circulation, the thickness of the walls, the arrangement of the chambers reflects an understanding of food preservation that was baked into the very bones of the building. When you build a castle, you're not just building defenses, you're building a system for keeping people alive over time. And cold, dark, carefully constructed underground space was a non-negotiable part of that system. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever walked into a really old building, a cathedral crypt, an old farmhouse basement, a wine cave, and felt that particular quality of the air, that coolness that feels almost physical, like something you could hold in your hand? There is a reason that feeling is so distinctive. It is the accumulated thermal mass of centuries of stone doing exactly what medieval builders intended it to do. Those spaces weren't just old. They were designed to feel that way. The thickness of the stone, the depth below grade, the small high windows, if any, that minimized warm air infiltration, while still allowing minimal ventilation. These were not accidents of construction. They were the result of builders who understood in a deeply practical and embodied way what they were trying to achieve. And walking into one of those spaces today, especially if you know what you're looking for, is a kind of conversation across time. The stone is still doing its job, 800 years later. But storage, as sophisticated as it became, had its own significant challenges, and I think it's important to talk about those honestly. Because the medieval relationship with underground storage was not one of smooth, reliable success. It was a constant negotiation. Humidity was the great enemy. Get the moisture level wrong in a cellar too high, and you had mold creeping across everything. Not just surface mold easily brushed away, but the deep penetrating kind that worked its way into the core of a root vegetable or a cheese and destroyed it from the inside out. Rodents were another persistent problem. Rats and mice were not a minor inconvenience in a medieval cellar. They were a genuine threat to survival. A bad infestation in the weeks between harvest and deep winter could compromise a significant portion of a household's stored food. Medieval accounts from estate management, records from monastery documents, from household manuals return again and again to the challenge of keeping vermin out of storage spaces. Cats obviously were the primary biological control. The practical value of cats in medieval society had almost nothing to do with companionship and everything to do with grain stores and cellars. Stone-lined floors and walls helped. Raised shelving that kept food off the ground helped more. Carefully fitted wooden lids on barrels and crocks were essential. But none of these measures were perfect. Loss was always part of the calculation. And this constant grinding reality of partial loss is something I think we genuinely cannot fully appreciate from our position of refrigerated, vacuum-sealed, thoroughly preserved abundance. every medieval household that went into winter with a full cellar knew that not everything in it would survive until spring. The question was never, will we lose some food? The question was always, how much will we lose and will we still have enough? There is one more aspect of underground storage that I don't want to skip over because I think it reveals something important about the social structure of medieval communities. Access to underground storage was not equal. This might seem obvious. Of course, wealthy people had better facilities, but the specific ways in which inequality played out in food storage are illuminating. A large monastic community or a wealthy manor estate might have cellar space measured in hundreds of square feet, stone-lined, multi-chambered. With dedicated personnel, a cellarer a specific role in the monastic tradition, whose entire job was the management and rotation of stored provisions. The role of the cellarer in a medieval monastery was not a minor position. It required knowledge of which food stored best, where how to manage the rotation of stocks, older provisions used before newer ones to minimize waste, how to assess the condition of stored food by sight and smell, and how to plan consumption over the months to ensure that nothing critical ran out before the next harvest. These were genuine management skills, administrative skills, the kind of careful, systematic thinking that in a modern context we'd associate with logistics and supply chain management. And monasteries, it turns out, were extraordinarily good at it. Their survival records, the documents that show what monastic communities ate across the seasons, how they managed their provisions, when they experienced shortage, suggest that well-managed monasteries maintained food security at a level that most secular communities simply couldn't match. Which is one of the reasons, by the way, that monasteries became such important centres of local community support in difficult times. A monastery with a well-stocked cellar and a skilled cellarer was a resource. In famine years it was sometimes the only resource. And then there were the peasant households, who had in most cases a simple dug pit, perhaps lined with straw, perhaps covered with a wooden hatch. No dedicated management, no rotation strategy, no specialist knowledge beyond what had been passed down through the family. Just a hole in the ground and hope. The gap between those two realities, between the vaulted monastery cellar with its skilled cellarer and the peasant's earthen pit, is not just a gap in comfort or sophistication. It is a gap in survival probability. And when I think about the medieval food system as a whole, that gap sits with me. Because the ingenuity was real, the knowledge was real, the practical sophistication was real, but it was not equally distributed, and the people who most needed reliable food storage, the people living closest to the margin, with the least room for error, were precisely the ones with the least access to the best techniques. That is not a medieval problem. That is a very, very old human problem, one that we are in different forms still working on. So, we have gone deep into the earth. We've explored the cool, dark world beneath the farmhouse floor and the monastery courtyard. We have talked about stone and straw and soil and the quiet physics of the earth, doing what the earth has always done, unbothered, reliable, faithful to its own temperature across every season. But here is something worth sitting with as we move forward. Every preservation method we have talked about so far, the salt, the smoke, the cold, dark earth, every single one of them works by slowing things down, by creating conditions where decay proceeds so slowly that food outlasts the season. What we have not yet talked about is the preservation method that works in the opposite direction entirely, the one that doesn't slow decay down, the one that accelerates it, deliberately, controllably, and then somehow remarkably uses the products of that controlled decay to prevent any further decay from happening at all. It is the most counterintuitive idea in this entire story. And medieval people stumbled onto it almost certainly by accident somewhere back in the deep past before the Middle Ages even began. It gave them beer, it gave them cheese, It gave them bread with a depth of flavour that no commercial yeast can fully replicate. And it saved millions of lives in ways that had nothing to do with the flavour of the food. We're talking about fermentation, and the full, strange, beautiful story of how medieval people lived with and depended on the invisible world of microorganisms they never knew existed is exactly where we are headed next. Alright, so I need you to do something for me before we go any further. I need you to think about the last time you ate something sour, not unpleasantly sour, not this milk has turned sour, the good kind. A spoonful of yogurt in the morning, a forkful of sauerkraut alongside a bratwurst, a slice of sourdough bread with that particular tang that supermarket bread simply does not have, a cold glass of beer at the end of a long day. Now hold that flavour in your mind for a second, because what you are tasting in every single one of those things is not just food. You are tasting survival. You're tasting the residue of one of the most important biological discoveries in all of human history. A discovery that nobody made deliberately. A discovery that happened as the best ones often do because someone left something out a little too long, and then instead of throwing it away took a cautious sniff, a tentative taste and thought, actually, that's not bad. Fermentation is at its core a process of transformation. You take a food grain, milk, cabbage, grapes, apples, practically anything with sufficient sugars or starches, and you introduce microorganisms or simply allow the ones already naturally present to do their work. Those microorganisms, yeasts, bacteria, various combinations thereof consume the sugars and produce byproducts. Alcohol in some cases, lactic acid in others, carbon dioxide, acetic acid. And here is the key thing, the thing that makes fermentation so extraordinary as a preservation tool. Those byproducts create an environment that is hostile to the specific bacteria responsible for decay and illness. In other words, the fermentation process, by transforming the food into something else, simultaneously poisons the environment against the microorganisms that would otherwise destroy it. It is, when you think about it, one of the most elegant defense mechanisms in nature. You fight invisible threats with other invisible things. You use controlled beneficial microbial activity to prevent harmful microbial activity. A biological arms race playing out inside a clay pot in a medieval farmhouse, and the people managing that pot had absolutely no idea that was what they were doing. They just knew it worked. The question of where fermentation begins as a human practice is genuinely humbling, because the honest answer is we don't know. We know it is extraordinarily old. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans were producing fermented beverages, likely grain-based, possibly fruit-based, as far back as 9,000 years ago in China. There is a theory, contested but fascinating, that the desire for reliably fermented grain was actually one of the driving forces behind the shift from nomadic hunter-gatherer life to settled agriculture. Not bread as we usually tell the story, beer. The argument goes roughly like this: wild grains are nutritious but unpredictable. Fermenting them into a stable beverage concentrates their nutrition, neutralizes some of their natural toxins, and creates something that keeps far longer than raw grain would. The drive to have a reliable supply of that beverage may have been enough to motivate people to stay in one place plant deliberately and develop the infrastructure of settled life. Now I want to be careful here. This is a hypothesis, not a settled historical conclusion. Scholars debate it vigorously, but even as a hypothesis I find it remarkable. The possibility that civilization, agriculture, settlement, the whole trajectory of human organization, might have grown partly out of the desire to reliably produce fermented food and drink. That our entire modern world traces one of its deepest roots back to someone somewhere discovering that left-out grain becomes something powerful and strange and worth building your life around. In medieval Europe specifically, fermentation was everywhere, And I mean that in the most literal possible sense. It was in the bread, it was in the ale, it was in the wine, it was in the cheese, it was in the preserved vegetables, it was in the butter. It was in the preserved fish sauces that coastal communities used as flavour enhancers, in the same way their Roman predecessors had used garum, that pungent, extraordinarily intense fermented fish condiment that had been a cornerstone of Roman cooking, and whose tradition in various forms persisted well into the medieval period along Mediterranean coastlines. Fermentation was not a technique that medieval people chose to use alongside other techniques. It was the baseline condition of most of what they ate. Let me start with the one that I think most people underestimate, and that is ale. Not wine gets all the historical romance, all the monastery associations, all the sophisticated cultural narrative. Ale, small ale specifically, a low-alcohol fermented grain beverage that was produced in enormous quantities in medieval England and northern Europe, and that was consumed daily by virtually everyone, including children. Let that sit for a second. Including children. And before you raise an eyebrow at that, the alcohol content of small ale was genuinely low. Estimates from historical brewing records suggest somewhere around 1 to 2% alcohol by volume, compared to the 5% or more in a modern beer. The reason it was given to children and to everyone else constantly as a replacement for water was not intoxication, it was safety. Medieval water sources were frequently contaminated. Rivers, wells, and communal water supplies near populated areas were regularly compromised by animal waste, human waste, and the general biological chaos of pre-modern settlement. Waterborne illness, dysentery, typhoid fever, and various other gastrointestinal diseases was a genuine persistent killer. Ale was not, because the brewing process, even for small ale, involved heating the liquid which killed most pathogens, and then the fermentation process produced enough alcohol and acidity to prevent recontamination. Drinking ale was in a very real sense drinking treated water. And medieval people without any concept of germ theory or water contamination had figured this out empirically. They didn't know why ale was safer than water from the river. They just knew that people who drank mostly ale got sick less often than people who drank mostly water. That observation, followed carefully across generations, saved an incalculable number of lives. And here is where I want to offer a personal observation, because I think it changes how we see medieval people. We tend to characterize medieval peasants and common people as uneducated, as superstitious, as having a fundamentally irrational relationship with the world. But when I look at the evidence of what they actually did, what they ate, how they preserved their food, how they managed their water supply, I see something different. I see people who were extraordinarily good at reading outcomes. They didn't have the theoretical framework to explain why fermented beverages were safer than raw water, but they had generations of observation. They had the accumulated evidence of who got sick and who didn't. They had what we might call, in a modern context, empirical data, gathered not in a laboratory, but in the brutal, uncontrolled experiment of daily life, and they acted on it, consistently, intelligently, effectively. That is not ignorance dressed up as wisdom. That is genuine wisdom operating without the vocabulary we would use to describe it. Now let's talk about something even more interesting than ale. Let's talk about sour vegetables. Because while fermented beverages get most of the historical attention, the fermentation of vegetables, particularly in Eastern and Northern Europe, was arguably just as important to survival, and in some ways more fascinating from a nutritional standpoint. The most famous example is sauerkraut, but the tradition of fermenting vegetables in salt brine, essentially lactofermentation, where naturally occurring bacteria on the surface of vegetables convert sugars into lactic acid, was practiced across medieval Europe in countless regional variations. Turnips, cabbages, roots of various kinds, even certain fruits, packed tightly into crocks or barrels with salt, and sometimes water-sealed and left to ferment for days or weeks. The result was a preserved food that could last through an entire winter. But here is the part that makes this more than just a survival story. The fermentation process actually increased the nutritional value of those vegetables in some significant ways. The lactic acid bacteria responsible for the fermentation are producers of certain B vitamins. They break down some of the plant cell structures in ways that make nutrients more bioavailable, easier for the human digestive system to absorb. And crucially, this matters enormously in the context of medieval winter. Nutrition-fermented cabbage retains significant levels of vitamin C even through the months of storage. Fresh cabbage, by contrast, loses much of its vitamin C over time, particularly if stored for months in a root cellar. Sauerkraut held on to it. This is why Northern European populations, who by rights should have suffered severe vitamin C deficiency, through the long winter months when fresh vegetables were unavailable, largely did not. The fermented cabbage in the barrel in the cellar was keeping them healthy in a way that no one could have designed consciously because no one knew what a vitamin was. The protection was real, the mechanism was invisible, and the people eating the sauerkraut survived the winter with their health intact and had no idea why. I have to tell you about one particular aspect of medieval fermentation that I find almost poetically strange: the sourdough starter. If you have ever kept a sourdough starter, that jar of living, bubbling flour and water paste that you feed every day and that you treat, if you are being honest with yourself with more care than some houseplants, then you have a personal connection to medieval food preservation that is more direct than almost anything else in this story. A sourdough starter is a community of wild yeast and bacteria captured from the surrounding environment, living in symbiosis in the flour-water mixture. It leavens bread, makes it rise, but it also critically acidifies the dough. The lactic and acetic acids produced by the bacteria in the starter lower the pH of the bread, which slows the growth of mold and extends the shelf life of the finished loaf significantly compared to bread leavened with commercial yeast. In a medieval household where bread was baked once or twice a week rather than daily, that extended shelf life mattered enormously. But here is the thing about sourdough starters that genuinely moves me when I think about it. They are continuous. A starter that is fed and maintained does not die. It is passed from mother to daughter, from baker to apprentice, from one generation to the next. There are bakeries operating today, some in San Francisco, some in Europe, that trace their starters back to the 19th century. There are almost certainly starters in existence today that descend through an unbroken chain of daily feedings and careful maintenance from medieval baking traditions. Living cultures thousands of years old, still doing the same work, still converting flour and water into something nourishing and lasting and deeply, irreducibly human. And then there is cheese. Oh, cheese. I could spend an entire episode, maybe several, on the history of medieval cheese making, and I will restrain myself here only because we have so much more ground to cover. But I want to say this cheese is fermentation's greatest achievement, not just as a food, as a concept, because what cheesemaking does what the monks and farm wives and estate dairy workers of medieval Europe were doing when they curdled milk, pressed it, salted it, and then waited, is they were taking the most perishable substance in their world and transforming it through the controlled action of specific bacteria and molds into something that could last for months or years. Fresh milk in a warm medieval dairy would begin to sour within hours. Properly made hard cheese aged in a cool cellar, turned regularly maintained carefully, could last a year, could survive the winter, could be stored against scarcity in a way that fresh milk simply could never be. The transformation is not metaphorical. The milk genuinely ceases to exist in any meaningful sense as milk. It becomes something new, something that carries the nutrition of the original milk but in a form that time cannot easily touch. In medieval England, records from the 12th and 13th centuries show that large estates maintained substantial dairy operations, not just for fresh milk consumption, but specifically for cheese production as a preservation strategy. Certain monasteries, particularly in what is now the north of England and in parts of France, developed cheese varieties that were distinctive enough to be recognized and valued in regional markets. The connection between monastic tradition and European cheese heritage is not coincidental. It is the direct result of communities that had both the knowledge, the facilities, and the long-term institutional continuity to develop and refine fermentation techniques across multiple generations. We will come back to the monasteries in a later chapter, because their contribution to medieval food science deserves its own dedicated time. But let me bring this all back to something personal, because I think that is what makes these stories stick. Fermentation is the only preservation method in this entire series that is fundamentally alive. Salt is a mineral, smoke is a chemical process, cold is physics, but fermentation is biology. It is the harnessing of living organisms, creatures so small that medieval people had no idea they existed to do work on behalf of human survival. There is something about that relationship between human beings and the invisible microbial world that strikes me as one of the most profound and underappreciated partnerships in all of history. We didn't domesticate only animals and plants. We domesticated microorganisms, yeasts, bacteria, the entire invisible ecosystem that lives in a crock of fermenting cabbage, or a jar of sourdough starter, or a wheel of aging cheese. We coaxed them. We created conditions they thrived in. We learned to read their moods when the starter was too acidic, when the brine had gone wrong, when the fermentation had proceeded just far enough and needed to be stopped. We became, without knowing it, managers of microbial communities, partners with the invisible, and they in return kept us alive. Now, while fermentation was keeping people alive through one set of mechanisms, lactic acid, alcohol, acidity, there was another group of medieval practitioners who were approaching the preservation problem from a completely different direction. Not transformation through microbiology, transformation through something much more luxurious, much more golden, much more viscous and sweet and ancient. We're talking about honey fat and the art of sealing food away from the world entirely, of creating conditions so inhospitable to decay that food could survive not just a season but years. And the methods medieval people developed to achieve this, the techniques that gave us comfort, honey-preserved fruits, fat-sealed cheeses and wax-encased meats, are some of the most fascinating and some of the most delicious chapters in this entire story. Swing ki jo like koi fan namwa jao fan beije viet fan sauket noi mut ma chuji honey fat and wax, sealing food away from time itself. Golden. That is the word that keeps coming back to me when I think about this chapter. Not the gold of wealth or royalty, though we will get there. The other kind of gold. The warm, slow, viscous gold of honey moving in thick ribbons from a wooden spoon into a clay crock. The pale, almost translucent gold of rendered fat cooling to a solid seal across the surface of a pot of cooked meat. The dull, dusty gold of beeswax being pressed with warm hands around the rim of the sealed jar. 3 substances, 3 completely different materials, and yet all 3 were used in medieval Europe for exactly the same purpose, to build a wall between food and time, not a wall of salt crystals, not a wall of smoke chemistry, not the cold wall of underground stone, something altogether different. An airtight, breathless, absolute seal that cut food off from the outside world entirely from oxygen, from moisture, from the airborne microorganisms that were always invisibly looking for a way in. And the extraordinary thing is that all 3 of these sealing methods were not just effective. They were in their own particular ways actively hostile to the forces of decay. Let me start with honey, because honey is the oldest, far older than the medieval period, far older in fact than recorded history. Archaeological evidence of honey being used to preserve food goes back to ancient Egypt. There are documented cases of honey-sealed vessels found in Egyptian tombs containing food that was by any reasonable definition still preserved after more than 3,000 years. 3,000 years. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. Your refrigerator keeps things good for about a week, maybe 2, before you start getting suspicious about the leftovers. Honey kept things for 3,000 years. Now, obviously, the conditions in an Egyptian tomb are not standard kitchen conditions, but the underlying chemistry is real, and it works in medieval cellars just as effectively as it worked in ancient burial chambers. Honey is, from a microbiological standpoint, almost uniquely hostile to the organisms responsible for food spoilage. It has extremely low water activity, the same principle we encountered with salt and drying, but achieved through a completely different mechanism. Honey is so saturated with dissolved sugars that there is almost no free water available for bacteria or molds to use for their metabolic processes. They cannot grow in it. They cannot reproduce in it. They essentially suffocate in it, metabolically speaking. Additionally, honey contains small amounts of hydrogen peroxide produced naturally by an enzyme that bees deposit during the production process. Hydrogen peroxide is an antimicrobial compound. Medieval people did not know about hydrogen peroxide. They did not know about water activity or osmotic pressure, or any of the chemistry underlying what they were doing. They knew that fruit sealed in honey did not rot. They knew that certain meats stored under honey lasted through winter when nothing else would. And they knew that honey itself, pure sealed honey, simply never seemed to go bad. Which, if you think about it, must have seemed almost miraculous. Everything rots, everything decays, everything succumbs to time, except honey. In medieval Europe, honey preservation was used primarily for fruits. The stone fruits of summer cherries, plums, quinces, and certain varieties of pear were particularly prized candidates for honey sealing because they were sweet enough to complement honey's flavour, but perishable enough to be useless in winter without intervention. The technique varied by region and household, but the basic approach was consistent. The fruit was cleaned, sometimes lightly cooked to drive off surface moisture, and then packed into a clay or ceramic vessel, and covered completely with honey, every surface, every gap, every possible avenue of air contact sealed off by the thick golden liquid. The vessel was then stoppered and stored. Done well, the result could last not just through the winter, but into the following year. Medieval recipe collections from the 13th and 14th centuries contain repeated references to fruit preserved in honey as a luxury item, something served at the tables of the wealthy as a sweet course, or used to flavour cooked dishes when fresh fruit was unavailable. The combination of honey's natural sweetness with the concentrated, slightly intensified flavour of the preserved fruit produce something genuinely more complex than the original fresh version. This is the detail that I keep finding remarkable. The preservation process did not just maintain the food, it improved it. The months spent sealed in honey changed the fruit in subtle ways, slightly firming the texture, allowing the natural fruit sugars to interact with honey's sugars in ways that deepened and concentrated the flavour. You started with the cherry. You ended with something richer, more complex, more interesting. You ended with something that winter had made more itself rather than less. Now here is something I did not know until I went looking for it, and it genuinely surprised me. Honey was not exclusively used for sweet foods. Meat was also preserved in honey in medieval Europe. Not commonly, honey was expensive enough that using it for meat preservation was a luxury that most households could not afford. But the historical record documents it. Certain meats, particularly small birds and game that were considered high-status foods, were packed in honey after cooking and sealed for storage. The effect was a product that was simultaneously preserved, flavoured and transformed. The honey drew some moisture from the meat while providing its antimicrobial barrier, and the long contact between the meat and the honey created a flavour profile that was by all medieval accounts considered a significant delicacy. This is not so different conceptually from what modern chefs do when they use honey glazes or honey-based cures. The technique has been modernised, refined, applied with 21st century understanding of the food chemistry involved. But the underlying insight that honey and meat together produce something extraordinary was worked out empirically in medieval kitchens by practitioners who understood it entirely through taste and outcome. Let me turn now to fat, specifically to one of the most interesting and underappreciated preservation techniques in all of medieval cooking: confit. If you have eaten duck confit in a French restaurant, and if you have not, I would gently suggest you rectify that at your earliest convenience. Then you have eaten a dish whose preservation logic is entirely medieval. The word confit comes from the French confire, meaning to preserve, and in its medieval form, confit was a preservation technique first and a cooking method second. Here is how it worked. A piece of meat, most commonly duck, goose or pork, because these animals produce sufficient fat for the purpose, was first heavily salted and left to cure for a day or more. The salt drew out moisture and began the preservation process from within. The salted meat was then cooked very slowly, very gently for an extended period, submerged in its own rendered fat, not at a high temperature, not until browned or caramelized, at a low trembling heat that was barely above the point of simmer for sometimes several hours, until the meat was thoroughly cooked through and every trace of remaining moisture had been driven from the tissue. The cooked meat was then lifted out and packed into a clay pot, and the hot fat, all of that rendered clarified liquid fat, was poured over it until every surface of every piece was completely covered. As the fat cooled, it solidified. It contracted slightly as it hardened, pressing against the meat below, and the walls of the pot around it, creating a seal that was for practical purposes completely airtight. No oxygen, no moisture, no access for airborne microorganisms. The meat sat inside its fat tomb, entirely cut off from the external environment. And here is what makes confit genuinely remarkable from a food science perspective, separate from its preservation function. The fat does not just seal the meat, it also communicates with it. Over the weeks and months of storage, the fat slowly penetrates the surface layers of the meat, replacing the moisture that has been removed, and changing the texture and flavour of the meat in ways that were impossible to achieve through any other cooking method. Properly made confit aged for several weeks in its fat has a richness and a depth of flavour that freshly cooked meat simply cannot match. The texture becomes silkier. The fat content of the meat increases slightly, making it more unctuous, more satisfying. The salt from the initial cure redistributes itself more evenly through the meat during storage, so that instead of a salty exterior and a blander interior, you get a consistent, well-seasoned depth of flavour throughout. Medieval cooks did not plan any of this. They were trying to preserve duck for winter. But what they discovered through the accidental alchemy of time and fat and salt was one of the most delicious preparations in all of European culinary tradition. The technique survived not because it was useful. It survived because once you had eaten confit that had been properly aged in its fat, you did not want the alternative. Now you might reasonably ask, how long did confit actually last? The historical record on this is specific enough to be reassuring. Medieval household manuals and estate records suggest that properly made confit sealed completely in fat stored in a cool cellar could keep for somewhere between 3 and 6 months without significant quality loss. Some accounts suggest even longer under ideal conditions. This is again not so far from what modern refrigeration achieves with similar products. The physics of oxygen exclusion works regardless of the century, and the cellar temperatures we discussed in an earlier chapter, that steady 50-degree Fahrenheit environment maintained by the thermal mass of the Earth, provided exactly the cold storage conditions that slowed any residual enzymatic activity within the fat itself. Fat can go rancid over time. Even without microbial activity, it oxidizes in contact with air, developing off flavors that eventually make it unpleasant. But inside a sealed crock in a cool cellar with no air contact and no light, the oxidation was dramatically slowed. The confit held. Can I ask you something? Think about the last thing you sealed tightly in your kitchen. A leftover container snapped closed, a zip bag pressed shut, a jar lid twisted down firmly. You did not think about why you were sealing it. You just sealed it automatically because you know that sealed things keep better. That knowledge that sealing food away from air extends its life is so deeply embedded in how we think about food storage that we no longer register it as knowledge at all. It just seems obvious, but it was not obvious. It had to be discovered, had to be observed, tested, refined, practiced, and transmitted across generations until it became second nature. And the medieval practitioners of honey preservation and confit and wax sealing were in their kitchens and their cellars, doing the hard work of making that discovery obvious for us. Testing the seal, checking the results, adjusting the technique, passing it forward. Wax sealing deserves its moment here too, because it operated on the same oxygen exclusion principle, but was used differently primarily for hard cheeses and for the outer seals of ceramic storage vessels. Beeswax heated to a liquid state was painted or poured over the exterior of a cheese rind, or pressed into the gaps around a crock stopper, and then allowed to cool and harden into an impermeable coat. Properly wax-sealed cheese could age in a cool cellar for many months, in some cases for over a year, with the rind protected from excessive moisture loss, and the interior protected from the surface molds that might otherwise penetrate too deeply. This is not so different from what modern artisan cheesemakers still do. The wax coating on a wheel of Gouda or Edam, that familiar red or yellow or black exterior, is the direct descendant of medieval beeswax preservation practice. The material has evolved slightly. The principle has not changed at all. I find something quietly moving about the three substances we've explored in this chapter: honey, fat, wax. All of them produced by living things. The honey by bees from the nectar of flowers, the fat by the animal whose meat it preserved the duck's own fat, sealing the duck's own flesh. The wax again by bees, the same creatures responsible for the honey. There is something almost circular about it. Life producing the substances that preserve life. The natural world providing from its own biology the tools to push back against the decay that is also part of natural biology. Medieval people experienced this circularity without analysing it. They kept bees not just for honey to eat but for wax to seal with, and those were understood as connected functions of the same creature. The orchard and the beehive and the dairy and the larder were not separate systems. They were parts of a single integrated relationship between the household and the natural world it depended on. Everything connected to everything else. Every resource serving multiple purposes. Nothing wasted. There is one last thing I want to say about honey and fat and wax preservation before we move on. These techniques were not exclusively the domain of the wealthy. Salt was expensive. Certain spices were eye-wateringly costly. Even good preserving quality wood for smoking was not universally accessible. But honey in a world where almost every rural household kept bees, or had access to someone who did, was more democratically available than its reputation as a luxury ingredient suggests. Rendered fat was if anything more accessible to ordinary households than to wealthy ones, because ordinary people killed and processed their own animals and rendered every ounce of fat themselves, wasting nothing. And beeswax, similarly, was a byproduct of honey production available wherever bees were kept. These were not aristocratic techniques. They were household techniques practiced at every level of medieval society, scaled up or down, according to what was available and what needed preserving. The wealthy households sealed their finest game and their most prized fruits in the purest filtered honey and the most carefully made confit. The peasant households sealed their small autumn slaughter of duck or goose in whatever fat the bird had yielded, and stoppered their vegetable crocks with whatever wax they could manage. Different scales, different qualities of ingredient, same fundamental understanding, same fundamental act of reaching forward through time, sealing something valuable away from decay, trusting that it would still be there when winter deepened and the cellar was the only kitchen left. And with that, we've now moved through some of the most intimate and domestic aspects of medieval preservation, the individual techniques practiced in individual kitchens and cellars by individual families working with what they had. But the medieval food world was not only domestic, it was also institutional, and no institution in medieval Europe approached the challenge of food preservation with more systematic intelligence, more accumulated expertise, or more lasting consequence than the one we're about to enter. A world of stone corridors and daily bells and patient, methodical, generation after generation refinement of every technique we have discussed. A world where preservation was not just practical necessity, it was in its own way a form of devotion. The monasteries are waiting, and what happened inside their walls, what those communities built and discovered and passed forward across centuries, is one of the most remarkable and underappreciated chapters in the entire history of human food. You know what strikes me every time I walk through a farmer's market in the fall? The dried things, the bundles of herbs hanging upside down, the strings of dried mushrooms, the leathery rings of apple slices, the hard dark sheets of dried fruit that look almost nothing like the plump soft originals they came from. People buy them almost casually now, a little bundle here, a small bag there, something to add flavour to a winter stew or a holiday recipe. But every single one of those dried things is a direct descendant of one of the oldest and most fundamental acts of human survival that has ever existed on this planet. And the more I learn about how medieval people used drying not just as a backup method, not just as a supplement to salt or smoke, but as a complete, sophisticated, regionally varied science of its own, the more I think we have fundamentally underestimated it. Let me start with the basics, because I think the biology here is actually worth understanding, not in a textbook way, but in the way that makes you go, oh, that's why it works. Microbial decay, the process by which food rots, is almost entirely dependent on water. Bacteria, molds, and yeasts need moisture to metabolize, to reproduce, to do the invisible biological work that turns fresh food into something inedible. Remove the water, reduce what food scientists now call water activity below a certain threshold, and those organisms either die or go dormant. They simply cannot function in a sufficiently dry environment. This is not a complicated idea. But the implications of it, followed carefully and systematically, produce some of the most impressive food preservation achievements in all of medieval history. And unlike salt, which required trade routes and significant expense, unlike smoke, which required specific wood and dedicated structures, drying in its most basic form required almost nothing, just air and time. But here is what tends to get overlooked. Medieval drying was not one thing. It was a spectrum of techniques, each adapted to specific climates, specific foods, and specific preservation goals. And the sophistication of that spectrum is something I genuinely did not appreciate until I started reading closely. In the warm, dry regions of southern Europe, the Mediterranean coastlines, the sun-baked plains of Castile and Aragon, the dry interior of southern France, sun-drying was the dominant method. fruits, vegetables, fish, and certain cuts of meat were spread on flat surfaces. Stone tables, woven reed mats, wooden racks, and exposed to direct sunlight and moving air for days or weeks. The combination of solar radiation and low ambient humidity could reduce the water content of certain foods dramatically. Figs, for instance, went from roughly 80% water content when fresh to something closer to 20 to 25% when properly dried. At that moisture level, mold growth becomes almost impossible without extraordinary contamination. The dried figs that Mediterranean traders were selling in northern European markets in the 13th and 14th centuries, figs that had travelled hundreds of miles overland and by sea, that had sat in warehouses and on ship decks and in market stalls, had been effectively preserved by nothing more than the Andalusian sun. Now contrast that with the north, in Scandinavia, in Iceland, in the North Sea coastal communities of England and the Low Countries. The sun was not reliable, but something else was. Wind. Cold, dry, relentless Arctic and North Atlantic wind. And the people of these regions looked at their brutal climate, the same climate that made agriculture difficult, that shortened growing seasons, that brought darkness and cold for months, and they turned it into an advantage. I mentioned stockfish briefly when we talked about smoking, but I want to give it the attention it fully deserves here, because stockfish is arguably the greatest achievement of wind drying in human history. The production of Norwegian stockfish was not a casual, occasional activity. It was an industry. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the Lofoten Islands off the northern coast of Norway, sitting above the Arctic Circle, battered by some of the most consistently strong cold, dry winds anywhere in Europe, had become one of the most economically important food production regions on the continent. Every year, from approximately January through April, enormous shoals of Atlantic cod migrated south along the Norwegian coast to spawn in the warmer waters around the Lofoten archipelago, and every year the fishing communities of those islands were waiting for them. The cod were caught in vast quantities. The records from the 14th and 15th centuries describe catches so large that the sea seemed almost to be made of fish, gutted, split down the backbone, and then hung by the tail on large outdoor wooden racks called yell. These racks could be enormous. A single large yell might hold thousands of fish at once, their split bodies spread open like pale wings suspended in the wind. And then nothing. Just wind and cold and time for approximately 3 months. Think about that process for a moment, because I think the engineering intelligence embedded in it is genuinely remarkable. The Lofoten climate in late winter and early spring sits at what turns out to be almost perfectly the ideal temperature range for drying fish without freezing it solid or allowing bacterial growth, just above freezing cold enough to prevent the rapid bacterial multiplication that would occur at warmer temperatures, but not cold enough to freeze the moisture inside the fish, which would damage the cellular structure and compromise the final product. The wind provides constant airflow across the surface of the fish, continuously removing the moisture that evaporates as the drying proceeds, and the combination of those two factors, the right temperature, the right airflow, produces a rate of moisture removal that is consistent enough to prevent surface mold from establishing before the interior of the fish dries sufficiently. Medieval Lofoten fishermen did not think in those terms. They thought in terms of this is how our fathers did it, and their fathers before them, and the fish kept and we ate. But the underlying logic was sound. The physics was exactly right, and the result after 3 months hanging in the wind was a piece of fish so thoroughly dried that it had roughly 15% of its original water content. Hard as wood, essentially indestructible if kept dry, with a shelf life measured not in weeks, but in years. Now here is a detail that I find almost comical in the best possible way. Stockfish in its fully dried state is almost completely inedible without significant preparation. The texture is by all historical accounts roughly comparable to a plank of thin wood. You could not bite into it. You could barely cut it with a knife. Before it could be cooked and eaten, stockfish required extended soaking in fresh water, changing the water regularly, sometimes over a period of 24 to 48 hours, to rehydrate it to a state where it was actually chewable. Some historical sources describe an additional preparatory step, beating the dried fish with a wooden mallet or a stone to begin breaking down the fibres before soaking. You're literally beating your dinner with a hammer before you cook it, which I have to say sounds either deeply satisfying or deeply exhausting depending on how your day has gone. But here is the point, and it is worth making clearly. The inconvenience of preparation was completely acceptable because the alternative was no dinner. The dried fish that required 48 hours of soaking to become edible was infinitely preferable to fresh fish that you didn't have because it had rotted 2 weeks ago. Preservation always involves a trade-off. Always. The question medieval people were answering every time they chose a preservation method was, what trade-off can we live with? And for the communities that depended on stockfish, the sailors who provisioned their ships with it, the inland communities that bought it from coastal traders, the monasteries that consumed it on the numerous fast days when meat was prohibited, the trade-off was obviously completely worth it. Let me ask you something genuinely interesting here. Do you know how far stockfish travelled? Not from Norway to the nearest English port, but how far it actually penetrated into the European interior. Trade records from the 13th and 14th centuries from the Hanseatic League archives, from English customs records from Italian merchant accounts, show stockfish reaching markets in landlocked Germany and Switzerland, in the river cities of France. There is documentation of dried Norwegian cod being sold in Italian markets in Venice and Genoa, where it competed alongside Mediterranean dried fish products. It became in parts of Italy a preserved food so integrated into local cooking traditions that regional preparations of rehydrated dried cod are still considered heritage dishes today. A fish caught north of the Arctic Circle, dried by subarctic wind travelling by ship and cart and mule to a kitchen in Tuscany or Calabria. Preservation made that journey possible. Without the drying, the fish would have been inedible long before it crossed the Alps. With it, the fish had been effectively paused in time removed from the normal trajectory of decay and held indefinitely until someone was ready to bring it back. Now, drying was not exclusively the domain of fish and the dramatic industrial-scale operations of the Norwegian coast. At the domestic level in the household, in the kitchen garden, in the small-scale daily management of food, drying was just as important, and the range of things dried was remarkable. Herbs first and foremost. The medieval kitchen garden was largely a medicine chest, as well as a food source herb served culinary, medicinal, and sometimes spiritual purposes simultaneously, and drying was how they were preserved from one growing season to the next. Bundles of thyme, rosemary, sage, hyssop, marjoram, and dozens of other plants were hung in cool, dry, well-ventilated spaces, not in the kitchen itself where the humidity from cooking would have introduced moisture and promoted mould, but in adjacent outbuildings in attic spaces with good airflow in the upper levels of barns. The timing of harvest mattered enormously. Medieval household guides, the livre de raison documents that some French households maintained, or the household management sections of English estate records contained detailed instructions for harvesting herbs at specific points in their growth cycle. Just before flowering in most cases, when the concentration of aromatic oils, the flavour compounds that make dried herbs worth using, was at its highest. After flowering, the oils diminish. The dried herb becomes less flavourful, less medicinally potent, less useful. This is knowledge that required attention across multiple growing seasons to accumulate. It required someone to notice that herbs harvested at different times produced dried products of noticeably different quality. It required that observation to be remembered and passed forward. Fruits were dried extensively as well, though the methods varied considerably by region and by fruit type. In Mediterranean regions, figs and dates and grapes dried into raisins were staples that travelled enormous distances and commanded significant prices in northern European markets. A sack of raisins in a 13th century English market was not a cheap commodity. It had travelled from Andalusia or from the Greek islands or from the Levant, preserved entirely by sun, and air packed in barrels carried across sea routes that were themselves dangerous and uncertain. In northern Europe, apples and pears were commonly dried, sliced thin and dried in residual oven heat, in the warmth remaining in a stone bread oven after the bread was removed. They became leathery, intensely sweet, shelf-stable versions of themselves that could be reconstituted in water for cooking or eaten as they were as a portable nutritious snack. There are estate records from the English Midlands in the 13th century that document dedicated apple-drying operations connected to larger orchards, organise systematic efforts to process significant quantities of autumn apple harvest into preserved form before the fruit could spoil. This was not casual housekeeping. This was food security planning executed at scale. And then there is a category of dried food that almost never gets mentioned in popular history, but that I think deserves a moment of recognition. Dried legumes, peas, beans, lentils. These were among the most important foods in the medieval diet, particularly for the poor who could not afford the quantities of salted meat that wealthier households consumed. And the great thing about legumes from a preservation standpoint is that they essentially dry themselves on the vine if left long enough. Allow a pea or a bean to fully mature and dry on the plant before harvest, and you have a food that stores almost indefinitely at room temperature with no additional preservation required. Dry enough to prevent mold, hard enough to resist insect damage if stored properly, nutritionally dense, filling. Medieval peasant households typically maintained substantial stores of dried beans and peas, stored in sacks, in clay pots, in grain chests, as their baseline insurance against food insecurity. If everything else failed, if the salt ran out, if the smoked meat was finished, if the cellar was empty, dried legumes were almost always still there, the literal last resort. And the fact that they required no special preparation, no specialist knowledge, no expensive ingredients to preserve, that they could be produced by anyone with a garden and a dry place to store them, made them the most democratic food in medieval Europe. Not the most prestigious, not the most delicious, but the most reliably, consistently available. And in a world where the alternative to reliably available was not eating, that was worth more than all the smoked hams and salted herrings in the manor house larder, I keep coming back in this whole series to the same quiet realization. Medieval food preservation was not a single thing. It was a layered system, salt and smoke and cold and fermentation and drying all working together, each method covering the weaknesses of the others, each adapted to specific foods and specific climates and specific social realities. No single method was enough on its own. The people who survived the winters best were not the ones who had mastered one technique brilliantly. They were the ones who had access to many techniques applied thoughtfully and in combination, and that layering, that redundancy, that refusal to depend on any single point of failure is actually a deeply sophisticated approach to a very hard problem. Modern supply chain engineers and food security planners talk about exactly this principle: diversification of methods, redundancy of systems, multiple pathways to the same critical outcome. Medieval people had no MBA, but they had 1,000 years of learning the hard way what happened when you only had one backup plan. So we've walked through the wind and the sun and the wood racks of Norway. We've followed dried figs from Andalusia to English market halls. We've watched a medieval farm wife hang bundles of thyme in a barn loft her timing calibrated by generations of household knowledge. And in all of this drying and waiting and careful attention to air and moisture and season, there is one community that practiced food preservation with a consistency and an institutional depth that ordinary households simply could not match. A community that had something rare in the medieval world time: continuity. The luxury of being able to refine techniques across not just one generation, but dozens. A community that kept written records, maintained dedicated facilities, and applied something very close to systematic inquiry to the question of how to keep food alive. They didn't call themselves scientists, they called themselves monks. And what the monasteries of medieval Europe built in their cellars and smokehouses and dairy rooms and herb gardens, the accidental food science of the cloister, is one of the most underappreciated intellectual achievements of the entire medieval period. That is the chapter we are stepping into right now. Picture this. It is the year 1140 somewhere in the Burgundy region of France. The sun has just cleared the low hills to the east, casting long pale light across a stone complex that sits in a shallow valley, sheltered from the worst of the winter wind, positioned deliberately close to a reliable stream, surrounded by carefully tended gardens that are only just beginning to wake up after the cold months. The bells ring for prime, the first prayer of the monastic day before breakfast, before work, before anything, and as the monks file into the church in their dark robes, quiet and unhurried, something is already happening in the buildings around them. In the dairy, the morning milk from the previous evening is being carefully tended, skimmed, measured, warmed to a precise temperature that the dairyman knows not from a thermometer, because no such instrument exists, but from the feeling of the liquid against the inside of his wrist. In the cellar beneath the main building, a junior monk is checking the barrels and crocks that line the walls, lifting lids, checking for mold recording in his memory exactly which vessels need attention and which can be left alone for another day. In the smokehouse adjacent to the outer wall, a low fire has been burning since before dawn, tended through the night by a lay brother, whose specific job, whose entire contribution to this community, is to keep that fire at exactly the right temperature. Not too hot, not too cold, just the particular slow-breathing heat that produces the right kind of smoke. And in the herbarium, the enclosed garden where medicinal and culinary plants are grown in systematic organized beds, an elderly monk is moving slowly between the rows, checking plants, noting what needs to be harvested before the day warms up and the volatile oils begin to dissipate. This is a monastery at work. And what I want you to understand, what I think most people completely miss, is that all of this activity, all of this careful, systematic daily attention to food and its preservation was not incidental to monastic life. It was inseparable from it. To understand why monasteries became the accidental food science laboratories of medieval Europe, you have to understand something about how monastic communities were structured. And specifically, you have to understand the rule of St. Benedict. The rule, written by Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century, adopted by Benedictine monasteries across Europe, and enormously influential on almost every subsequent monastic tradition, established a framework for daily life that was, among many other things, extraordinarily systematic about food. The rule specified when monks ate what they ate in different seasons, how food was to be prepared, who was responsible for different aspects of provisioning, and how the community's food stores were to be managed across the year. This was not an afterthought. Benedict understood with the practical intelligence that ran underneath all his spiritual guidance that community could not pray, could not study, could not fulfill any of its religious or intellectual functions if it was hungry. Food security was not a worldly distraction from spiritual life. It was the foundation on which spiritual life was built. And so the rule created roles. The cellarer, the monk responsible for the community's provision, storage and food management, was one of the most important positions in any Benedictine monastery. The rule specifically describes the qualities required of a good cellarer: wisdom, maturity, sobriety. Not just personal virtues, but the specific character traits of someone you could trust, to manage resources carefully, to plan across time, to neither waste nor hoard. In a modern organization, we would call this a supply chain director. In a medieval monastery, it was a sacred responsibility, and the men who held that role, the cellars of the great Benedictine houses, of the Cistercian abbeys, of the Cluniac priories, accumulated over decades of careful practice a depth of knowledge about food preservation that was simply unmatched anywhere else in medieval society. Here is what made monasteries genuinely different from even the larger secular estates, and I want to be precise about this because I think it is the key to understanding their contribution. Monasteries had institutional continuity. A secular lord might manage his estate brilliantly, but he died. His son might be less interested, less skilled, less attentive. His grandson might be at war for a decade and leave the estate to servants with no particular expertise. Knowledge accumulated in one generation could be lost entirely in the next. A monastery did not work that way. The institution persisted regardless of individual mortality. When the old cellarer grew too frail to continue his work, he trained his replacement, passing forward not just the practical knowledge, but the specific local knowledge: which cellar stayed coolest in summer, which barrels had the best seal, which supplier provided the most reliable salt, which local wood burned best for smoking the autumn fish delivery. And crucially, some of this knowledge was written down. Monastic libraries preserved not just theological texts, but practical documents, account books, inventory records, provisioning notes, brewing instructions, cheese-making guidelines. These were not literary works. They were not intended for posterity. They were working documents, the kind of thing you write, because the institution needs the information to function, not because you imagine someone 8 centuries later will be fascinated by it. And yet, here we are, 8 centuries later, fascinated by it. Let me give you something specific to hold on to, because I think the numbers tell a story that abstractions can't. The records of the Abbey of St. Gall, a Benedictine monastery in what is now Switzerland, one of the most significant monastic institutions of early medieval Europe, include detailed inventories of its food stores and production facilities from as early as the 9th century. The famous plan of St. Gall, drawn around the year 820, is a detailed architectural document showing the intended layout of an ideal monastery complex. And the food infrastructure in that plan is extraordinary in its comprehensiveness. There are dedicated spaces for baking, for brewing, for the production of mead, for the pressing of grapes, for the keeping of chickens, geese, and other fowl, for the tending of fish ponds, for the drying of herbs, for the storage of grain in a separate, properly ventilated granary. Fish ponds, a monastery that had its own controlled fish supply, not dependent on seasonal catches, not subject to the disruptions of trade routes, could guarantee a source of preserved protein that secular communities simply could not match. And the monks of St. Gall were managing those fish ponds, breeding and harvesting deliberately for centuries. That is institutional food security at a level that would be impressive in any era. Now I want to talk about something that tends to get romanticized in ways that I think actually obscure the real achievement. Monastic cheese. Yes, we all know that some of the most famous cheeses in European history have monastic origins. Epoisses from Burgundy, Port Salut from the Loire, Maroilles from northern France. Certain traditions of Gouda and Edam that trace roots to Low Countries monasteries. The blue cheese traditions of Auvergne. These are typically presented as happy accidents, as if a monk happened to leave some milk in a cave and something wonderful occurred. and there may be some truth to the accident part of certain specific discoveries, but the broader achievement, the development and refinement of distinct regional cheese traditions within monastic communities was anything but accidental. It was the product of exactly the kind of long-term systematic institutionally supported experimentation that only a monastery could provide. Consider what cheese-making actually requires if you want to do it consistently and well. You need a reliable milk supply, which means managing dairy animals with some expertise ensuring consistent nutrition and health. You need controlled temperature environments for aging, which monasteries with their stone cellars were exceptionally well positioned to provide. You need the ability to maintain specific bacterial and mold cultures across multiple batches, which requires both the microbiological luck of having the right organisms in your environment and the practical discipline to maintain the right conditions for them to persist. And you need time, lots of time. A good aged cheese takes months, some take years. To develop a cheese tradition to understand which milk, which cultures, which aging conditions, which humidity levels, which temperature ranges produce, the best result requires the ability to run dozens, perhaps hundreds of experimental batches over a span of years or decades, and to record what you learn, and to pass that knowledge forward. Only a monastery could do that consistently. Only an institution with the continuity, the facilities, the record-keeping discipline, and the sheer patient time horizon of a religious community could accumulate the depth of knowledge required to produce something like époisse. The cheese is not just delicious. The cheese is evidence of centuries of applied inquiry. I want to pause here and offer a thought that might be slightly provocative because I think it is worth sitting with. We tend to write the history of science as if it began with the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries. Francis Bacon, Galileo Galilei, René Descartes, the development of systematic experimentation, the rejection of received authority in favour of empirical observation, and in formal theoretical terms that history is accurate. But if we define science more simply as the systematic observation of natural phenomena, the recording of results, the refinement of methods based on outcome, and the transmission of accumulated knowledge across generations, then the cellars and brewers and cheesemakers of medieval monasteries were doing science. Not theoretical science, not science with mathematical models or formal hypotheses, but practical, empirical, outcome-driven inquiry into how the physical world works. They were asking what conditions produced the best result. They were observing this batch worked, that one didn't, what was different. They were recording the document that says which barrel, which cellar, which season, which supplier. And they were transmitting the novice learning from the old cellarer, the young dairy monk watching and asking and practicing under supervision. That is not so different in its essential logic from what happens in a research laboratory today. The vocabulary is entirely different. The understanding of a mechanism is entirely different. But the underlying cognitive process, careful attention, systematic comparison, recorded knowledge, iterative refinement is recognizably the same. The Cistercian monasteries deserve particular attention in this story because they represent what I think of as the most ambitious food production program in medieval Europe. The Cistercians, a reform movement within Benedictine monasticism that began at Citeaux in Burgundy in 1098, were committed to a stricter, more austere interpretation of the rule of St. Benedict. Part of that commitment meant radical self-sufficiency. Cistercian monasteries were required as far as possible to produce everything they needed within their own lands, no relying on markets, no dependence on outside suppliers. This meant farming at scale. It meant systematic animal husbandry. It meant managing forests for timber and fuel. It meant controlling water rights for mills and fish ponds. And it meant preserving food in sufficient quantities to feed a community of dozens or sometimes hundreds of monks lay brothers and associated workers through every season of the year. The Cistercian expansion across Europe from roughly 1100 to 1250, they established hundreds of new monasteries across France, England, Germany, Spain, and beyond was, among other things, an extraordinary agricultural enterprise. Cistercian monks and lay brothers cleared forests, drained marshes, built water management systems, and established productive farms in lands that had previously been considered too marginal for settlement. And at every site they built food storage infrastructure, stone cellars, granaries, smokehouses, breweries, dairies. The physical remains of Cistercian food storage facilities are still visible at sites across Europe today, at Rievaulx Abbey in Yorkshire, England, at Fontenay in Burgundy, at Poblet in Catalonia. The vaulted undercrofts, those beautiful stone-arched basement spaces that visitors now walk through as heritage sites, were not decorative architecture. They were refrigerators. They were the machinery of survival built in stone to last for centuries, and they did. There is one more dimension of the monastic contribution to food preservation that I want to give its proper weight, and that is the question of what monasteries meant to the communities around them. Because the food knowledge and the food security that monasteries built were not kept entirely within their walls. They leaked out. Monks interacted with local communities constantly through trade, through charity, through the provision of hospitality to travellers and pilgrims, through the employment of local workers as lay labourers. And in all of those interactions knowledge moved. A lay worker who spent years at a Cistercian granary learned something about grain storage. A woman who brought milk to a monastic dairy to sell observed something about how cheese was made there. A merchant who supplied salt to a monastery's preservation operation saw how much was being used and for what purpose. These interactions were not systematic technology transfer. They were informal, incidental, the kind of knowledge diffusion that happens whenever skilled people and unskilled people work alongside each other over extended time. But across generations and across the entire geography of medieval Europe, that diffusion added up to something significant. The food preservation knowledge that monasteries developed and refined did not stay in monasteries. It became part of the broader practical culture of medieval food management. Filtered through local adaptation, adjusted for different climates and resources, simplified where necessary for households with fewer facilities, but present, influencing, contributing to the overall level of food security that European communities could achieve. And here is what strikes me most when I step back and look at the full sweep of the monastic contribution to this story. The monks who built those cheese caves and tended those fish ponds and managed those cellars were not trying to advance human knowledge. They were trying to feed their community. They were trying to honour a rule written 600 years before them by a man who understood that hungry people cannot pray. They were trying to survive the winter with enough to eat, and in doing all of that in the faithful, disciplined daily execution of practical necessity, they accidentally built something that changed the food culture of an entire continent. That is not an unusual story in the history of human achievement. The most important things are often built by people who are not trying to build them, who are just trying to get through the day, just trying to keep the community fed, just trying with the resources available to them to hold back the darkness for one more season. Now, while the monasteries were building their quiet empire of preserved foods and accumulated knowledge, something else was happening in the larger medieval world. Something louder. Something that involved merchants and ships and wars and an almost incomprehensible quantity of money. Something that was at its root also about food preservation. About the desperate desire to make food last longer, taste better, and travel farther. We've been talking about the humble end of this story, the salt barrel, the smokehouse, the cellar, the crock of fermenting cabbage. But there was a luxury end to this story too. an end involving substances so rare, so expensive, so fiercely desired that controlling their supply could make a city fabulously wealthy, could fund navies, could drive explorers to sail off the edges of known maps, could indirectly result in the European discovery of an entire hemisphere. We are talking about spices, and the connection between the medieval spice trade and the preservation of food is far more direct, far more surprising, and far more consequential than almost anyone realizes. There is a myth, a very persistent, very widely repeated myth about medieval people and spices. You have probably heard it. It goes something like this. People in the Middle Ages used enormous quantities of expensive spices, pepper cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg to mask the taste of rotting meat. The image is almost comical if you think about it too long. A medieval cook standing over a barrel of questionable pork reaching for a fistful of pepper, worth more than a week's wages, thinking this will fix it. I want to tell you as gently but as directly as I can that this story is almost certainly wrong, and the real story, the actual historically grounded relationship between spices and medieval food preservation, is so much more interesting that I find it genuinely frustrating how rarely it gets told. Let me start by dismantling the myth properly, because I think it deserves that. The argument that spices were used to disguise spoiled meat collapses almost immediately when you examine the historical record with any seriousness. First, spices were extraordinarily expensive, not a bit pricey, expensive. Genuinely, almost incomprehensibly expensive by the standards of ordinary medieval life. In 14th century England, a pound of pepper, just pepper, could cost the equivalent of several days' wages for a skilled labourer. A pound of saffron could cost as much as a horse. Cloves, nutmeg and cinnamon from the Spice Islands of what we now call Indonesia travelled thousands of miles through multiple layers of intermediaries before reaching a Western European market, with each hand that touched them adding to their price. These were not condiments that any household used carelessly. They were measured out with the precision and the anxiety that you might apply today to something genuinely precious. Now, ask yourself, does it make economic sense to spend several days' wages on pepper in order to salvage a piece of meat that has already gone bad, when salt cheap available, effective salt was sitting right there, when you could simply discard the meat and cut your losses? The logic does not hold. Wealthy households, the only ones who could afford significant quantities of spice, were also the households with the best preservation infrastructure, the most reliable cold storage, the most skilled kitchen staff. They were the least likely to be serving spoiled meat, and the most likely to be using spices for reasons that had nothing to do with concealment. So what was the real relationship between spices and preservation? Here is where it gets genuinely fascinating. Many of the spices that medieval Europeans valued most highly contain compounds with real measurable antimicrobial properties. Pepper contains piperine, a compound that inhibits the growth of certain bacteria and molds. Cloves contain eugenol, one of the most potent natural antimicrobial substances known effective against a remarkably wide range of microorganisms. Cinnamon contains cinnamaldehyde, which has been shown in modern laboratory settings to inhibit bacterial growth even at relatively low concentrations. Ginger, nutmeg, turmeric, cardamom. Each of these contains specific bioactive compounds that have genuine documented effects on microbial activity. Medieval people did not know any of this. They did not know what eugenol was. They had never heard of cinnamaldehyde. They had no conceptual framework for understanding that a spice could inhibit bacterial growth, but they had something arguably just as valuable. Centuries of accumulated empirical observation about which spiced foods lasted longer, developed fewer problems in storage, and kept their quality better over time than their unspiced equivalents. They tasted the outcome, and the outcome told them spices help. Now, I want to be careful here because historical honesty requires it. The primary reason medieval people used spices was not preservation. It was flavor status and the complex web of medical theory that governed how educated medieval people thought about food and health. The humoral system of medicine inherited from ancient Greek and Roman medical tradition, and dominant throughout the medieval period, held that all foods had specific qualities: hot, cold, wet, or dry, and certain combinations of qualities were considered health-promoting while others were considered dangerous. Spices were generally classified as hot and dry qualities that were thought to aid digestion, counteract the cold and wet qualities of many preserved foods, and generally promote health. So spicing food was not just about flavor. It was about balancing the humoral properties of a meal in ways that medieval physicians genuinely believed would affect the health of those who ate it. This adds an entirely different dimension to the spice trade. Medieval people were not just buying flavor, they were buying health, or at least what they understood health to be. And the fact that some of those spices also happened to have genuine antimicrobial properties, that the hot and dry quality they believed in was sometimes a rough approximation of a real biological effect, is one of those wonderful moments where folk knowledge and modern science arrive at compatible conclusions through completely different paths. Let me tell you about pepper specifically, because pepper is where the story of spices in medieval Europe becomes almost impossible to fully comprehend from a modern perspective. Black pepper, Piper nigrum grown in southern India and parts of Southeast Asia, was the single most traded commodity in medieval international commerce. Not silk, not gold, not precious stones, pepper, a dried berry. In the ancient world, pepper was valuable enough to be used as currency. Alaric the Visigoth, when he sacked Rome in the year 410, demanded as part of his ransom 3,000 pounds of pepper, alongside gold and silver. 3,000 pounds of pepper as a ransom. This was not an eccentric demand. It was a demand for something that the Roman world recognized as genuinely equivalent in value to precious metal. Through the medieval period, the pepper trade flowed along routes of extraordinary complexity and length, from the growing regions of southern India and the Indonesian archipelago. Pepper moved by sea to the ports of the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf. From there overland by camel caravan across the Middle East and into the Eastern Mediterranean, into the hands of Byzantine and later Arab merchants who controlled access to the European market and charged accordingly at every stage. And finally, after a journey that might span 10,000 miles and multiple years, into the warehouses of Venice, Genoa, and the great trading cities of the Mediterranean coast, where it was sold to northern European buyers at prices that reflected every mile and every intermediary hand it had passed through. Venice built an empire on this trade. That is not hyperbole. The Venetian Republic's extraordinary wealth, the palaces, the art, the naval power, the political influence that made Venice one of the most significant cities in medieval Europe, was funded substantially by the profit margin between buying spices at eastern Mediterranean ports and selling them to northern European customers. The Venetians understood what they had. They protected it fiercely. They cultivated relationships with Eastern trading partners. They negotiated exclusive access. They built the most sophisticated commercial and financial infrastructure in medieval Europe specifically to manage the flow of spices and the enormous wealth it generated. And all of it, this entire glittering commercial edifice, rested on the fact that northern European households with any pretension to status wanted spices, wanted them badly enough to pay extraordinary prices, wanted them for flavor and for status and for the humoral health benefits they believed in. And here is the thread that connects this chapter to everything we've been discussing. Wanted them at least in part because spiced preserved foods genuinely kept better than unspiced ones. Not dramatically better, not in ways that would have been obvious to casual observation, but better enough over enough repeated experience to become part of the conventional wisdom of medieval food management. Add spices to your preserved meats. Add them to your pickled vegetables. Add them to your cured sausages. It helps. Medieval practitioners did not know why, but the accumulated wisdom of centuries of kitchen practice had arrived at the same conclusion that modern food scientists would eventually confirm through laboratory analysis. It helps. Now here is the connection that I find most extraordinary, the most direct, most consequential, most world-altering link between medieval food preservation and the shape of the modern world. By the 15th century, the spice trade and its extraordinary profitability had become a source of intense frustration for the Western European kingdoms that were paying Venetian and Arab middleman prices for Eastern goods. The desire to find a direct sea route to the spice-producing regions, bypassing the Eastern Mediterranean bottleneck, bypassing Venice, bypassing the Arab trading networks entirely, was one of the primary commercial motivations behind the great European voyages of exploration, not the only motivation. History is never that simple, but one of the most significant. When the Portuguese began systematically exploring the African coast through the latter half of the 15th century, working their way south year by year, decade by decade, they were looking for a route around Africa that would give them direct access to the spice markets of the Indian Ocean. When Vasco da Gama finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached the Indian Ocean in 1498, completing the sea route to India, he did not open a path to abstract geographic knowledge. He opened a direct line to pepper, to cloves, to cinnamon and nutmeg and ginger. Without the spice trade bottleneck and the enormous incentive to break it, the Portuguese exploration of the African coast proceeds differently, or perhaps not at all. And without Portuguese exploration of the African coast, the conceptual and practical groundwork for Columbus's westward voyage in 1492 looks very different. Columbus was not looking for a new world. He was looking for spices. He was looking for a western route to the same eastern markets that everyone in Europe was desperate to access more cheaply. He found something else entirely, and the world was never the same. I find it genuinely staggering when I follow this thread to its logical conclusion. The refrigerator in your kitchen, the grocery store 2 miles from your house, stocked with food from 6 continents, the global trading system that makes it possible to buy Chilean grapes in Minnesota in January. All of it, the entire architecture of modern global commerce, traces part of its origin back to a desire to keep food from spoiling, to a medieval cook who wanted pepper for her winter sausages, to a Venetian merchant who understood that controlling the supply of that pepper was the key to extraordinary wealth, to a Portuguese king who decided that the price of that Venetian monopoly was too high and sent ships south along the African coast to find a way around it, to Columbus pitching a westward voyage to the Spanish crown with spices as the prize, to the spice islands of the Indonesian archipelago whose existence Europeans had barely imagined becoming the centre of a colonial competition that reshaped the political geography of an entire hemisphere. All of that. Tracing back to the desire to preserve food, to make it last, to keep hunger at bay through the long months when nothing grew and everything depended on what had been put away. That is the spice trade. Not a story about exotic flavour or aristocratic indulgence, a story about the deep driving, civilization-shaping urgency of keeping food alive, and the extraordinary world-altering consequences of the human determination to do it better, more cheaply, more reliably. More than any other chapter in this series, the spice trade shows us that food preservation was not a domestic concern. It was a geopolitical force. It moved armies. It built navies. It founded cities. It opened hemispheres. It changed the map of the world. And it all began in some fundamental sense with the same question that the woman packing her salt barrel was asking. How do I make this last? But not everyone in medieval Europe had access to Venetian pepper or Genoese cinnamon. Not everyone could afford the luxury end of preservation, and the distance between those who could and those who could not, between the nobleman's spiced and honeyed table and the peasant's simple salted provisions, was not just a gap in flavour. It was a gap in survival probability, a gap in quality of life, a gap that mapped precisely onto the existing hierarchies of medieval society and reinforced them year after year in the most intimate possible way, through food, through what was on the table, through who had enough and who was always quietly calculating whether they would. That story, the class divide written in food, in preservation methods, in the difference between an ice house and an earthen pit, is exactly where we are headed next. Joklai koi fan tam va jau fan moi mot suingi ki kau truk viet fan chin va fan moi ket noi mut me. Fan chin, the spice trade flavour or preservation? The answer will surprise you. There is a myth, a very persistent, very widely repeated myth about medieval people and spices. You have probably heard it. It goes something like this. People in the Middle Ages used enormous quantities of expensive spices, pepper, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, to mask the taste of rotting meat. The image is almost comical if you think about it too long. A medieval cook standing over a barrel of questionable pork, reaching for a fistful of pepper, worth more than a week's wages, thinking this will fix it. I want to tell you as gently, but as directly as I can, that this story is almost certainly wrong. And the real story, the actual historically grounded relationship between spices and medieval food preservation, is so much more interesting that I find it genuinely frustrating how rarely it gets told. Let me start by dismantling the myth properly, because I think it deserves that. The argument that spices were used to disguise spoiled meat collapses almost immediately when you examine the historical record with any seriousness. First, spices were extraordinarily expensive, not a bit pricey expensive, genuinely almost incomprehensibly expensive by the standards of ordinary medieval life. In 14th century England, a pound of pepper, just pepper, could cost the equivalent of several days' wages for a skilled labourer. A pound of saffron could cost as much as a horse. Cloves, nutmeg and cinnamon from the Spice Islands of what we now call Indonesia travelled thousands of miles through multiple layers of intermediaries before reaching a Western European market, with each hand that touched them adding to their price. These were not condiments that any household used carelessly. They were measured out with the precision and the anxiety that you might apply today to something genuinely precious. Now, ask yourself, does it make economic sense to spend several days' wages on pepper in order to salvage a piece of meat that has already gone bad, when salt cheap available, effective salt was sitting right there? When you could simply discard the meat and cut your losses, the logic does not hold. Wealthy households, the only ones who could afford significant quantities of spice, were also the households with the best preservation infrastructure, the most reliable cold storage, the most skilled kitchen staff. They were the least likely to be serving spoiled meat, and the most likely to be using spices for reasons that had nothing to do with concealment. So what was the real relationship between spices and preservation? Here is where it gets genuinely fascinating. Many of the spices that medieval Europeans valued most highly contain compounds with real measurable antimicrobial properties. Pepper contains piperine, a compound that inhibits the growth of certain bacteria and molds. Cloves contain eugenol, one of the most potent natural antimicrobial substances, Known effective against a remarkably wide range of microorganisms, cinnamon contains cinnamaldehyde, which has been shown in modern laboratory settings to inhibit bacterial growth even at relatively low concentrations. Ginger, nutmeg, turmeric, cardamom. Each of these contain specific bioactive compounds that have genuine documented effects on microbial activity. Medieval people did not know any of this. They did not know what eugenol was. They had never heard of cinnamaldehyde. They had no conceptual framework for understanding that a spice could inhibit bacterial growth. But they had something arguably just as valuable. Centuries of accumulated empirical observation about which spiced foods lasted longer, developed fewer problems in storage, and kept their quality better over time than their unspiced equivalents. They tasted the outcome, and the outcome told them spices help. Now, I want to be careful here because historical honesty requires it. The primary reason medieval people used spices was not preservation. It was flavor status, and the complex web of medical theory that governed how educated medieval people thought about food and health. The humoral system of medicine inherited from ancient Greek and Roman medical tradition, and dominant throughout the medieval period, held that all foods had specific qualities: hot, cold, wet, or dry, and certain combinations of qualities were considered health-promoting while others were considered dangerous. Spices were generally classified as hot and dry qualities that were thought to aid digestion, counteract the cold and wet qualities of many preserved foods, and generally promote health. So spicing food was not just about flavor, it was about balancing the humoral properties of a meal in ways that medieval physicians genuinely believed would affect the health of those who ate it. This adds an entirely different dimension to the spice trade. Medieval people were not just buying flavor, they were buying health, or at least what they understood health to be. And the fact that some of those spices also happened to have genuine antimicrobial properties, that the hot and dry quality they believed in was sometimes a rough approximation of a real biological effect, is one of those wonderful moments where folk knowledge and modern science arrive at compatible conclusions through completely different paths. Let me tell you about pepper specifically, because pepper is where the story of spices in medieval Europe becomes almost impossible to fully comprehend from a modern perspective. Black pepper Piper nigrum, grown in southern India and parts of Southeast Asia, was the single most traded commodity in medieval international commerce. Not silk, not gold, not precious stones, pepper, a dried berry. In the ancient world, pepper was valuable enough to be used as currency. Alaric the Visigoth, when he sacked Rome in the year 410, demanded as part of his ransom 3,000 pounds of pepper alongside gold and silver. 3,000 pounds of pepper as a ransom. This was not an eccentric demand. It was a demand for something that the Roman world recognized as genuinely equivalent in value to precious metal. Through the medieval period, the pepper trade flowed along routes of extraordinary complexity and length, from the growing regions of southern India and the Indonesian archipelago. Pepper moved by sea to the ports of the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf. From there, overland by camel caravan across the Middle East and into the eastern Mediterranean, into the hands of Byzantine and later Arab merchants who controlled access to the European market and charged accordingly at every stage. And finally, after a journey that might span 10,000 miles and multiple years, into the warehouses of Venice, Genoa, and the great trading cities of the Mediterranean coast, where it was sold to northern European buyers at prices that reflected every mile and every intermediary hand it had passed through. Venice built an empire on this trade. That is not hyperbole. The Venetian Republic's extraordinary wealth, the palaces, the art, the naval power, the political influence that made Venice one of the most significant cities in medieval Europe, was funded substantially by the profit margin between buying spices at Eastern Mediterranean ports and selling them to Northern European customers. The Venetians understood what they had. They protected it fiercely. They cultivated relationships with Eastern trading partners. They negotiated exclusive access. They built the most sophisticated commercial and financial infrastructure in medieval Europe, specifically to manage the flow of spices and the enormous wealth it generated. And all of it, this entire glittering commercial edifice, rested on the fact that Northern European households with any pretension to status wanted spices, wanted them badly enough to pay extraordinary prices, wanted them for flavour and for status and for the humoral health benefits they believed in. And here is the thread that connects this chapter to everything we've been discussing. Wanted them at least in part because spice-preserved foods genuinely kept better than unspiced ones. Not dramatically better, not in ways that would have been obvious to casual observation, but better enough over enough repeated experience to become part of the conventional wisdom of medieval food management. Add spices to your preserved meats, add them to your pickled vegetables, add them to your cured sausages. It helps. Medieval practitioners did not know why, but the accumulated wisdom of centuries of kitchen practice had arrived at the same conclusion that modern food scientists would eventually confirm through laboratory analysis. It helps. Now here is the connection that I find most extraordinary. The most direct, most consequential, most world-altering link between medieval food preservation and the shape of the modern world. By the 15th century, the spice trade and its extraordinary profitability has become a source of intense frustration for the Western European kingdoms that were paying Venetian and Arab middleman prices for Eastern goods. The desire to find a direct sea route to the spice-producing regions, bypassing the Eastern Mediterranean bottleneck, bypassing Venice, bypassing the Arab trading networks entirely, was one of the primary commercial motivations behind the great European voyages of exploration. Not the only motivation. History is never that simple, but one of the most significant. When the Portuguese began systematically exploring the African coast through the latter half of the 15th century, working their way south year by year, decade by decade, they were looking for a route around Africa that would give them direct access to the spice markets of the Indian Ocean. When Vasco da Gama finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached the Indian Ocean in 1498, completing the sea route to India, he did not open a path to abstract geographic knowledge. He opened a direct line to pepper, to cloves, to cinnamon and nutmeg and ginger. Without the spice trade bottleneck and the enormous incentive to break it, the Portuguese exploration of the African coast proceeds differently, or perhaps not at all. And without Portuguese exploration of the African coast, the conceptual and practical groundwork for Columbus's westward voyage in 1492 looks very different. Columbus was not looking for a new world. He was looking for spices. He was looking for a western route to the same eastern markets that everyone in Europe was desperate to access more cheaply. He found something else entirely, and the world was never the same. I find it genuinely staggering when I follow this thread to its logical conclusion. The refrigerator in your kitchen, the grocery store 2 miles from your house stocked with food from 6 continents, the global trading system that makes it possible to buy Chilean grapes in Minnesota in January. All of it, the entire architecture of modern global commerce, traces part of its origin back to a desire to keep food from spoiling. To a medieval cook who wanted pepper for her winter sausages, to a Venetian merchant who understood that controlling the supply of that pepper was the key to extraordinary wealth, to a Portuguese king who decided that the price of that Venetian monopoly was too high and sent ships south along the African coast to find a way around it, to Columbus pitching a westward voyage to the Spanish crown with spices as the prize, to the spice islands of the Indonesian archipelago whose existence Europeans had barely imagined becoming the centre of a colonial competition that reshaped the political geography of an entire hemisphere. All of that, tracing back to the desire to preserve food, to make it last, to keep hunger at bay through the long months when nothing grew and everything depended on what had been put away. That is the spice trade. Not a story about exotic flavour or aristocratic indulgence, a story about the deep, driving, civilization-shaping urgency of keeping food alive, and the extraordinary world-altering consequences of the human determination to do it better, more cheaply, more reliably. More than any other chapter in this series, the spice trade shows us that food preservation was not a domestic concern. It was a geopolitical force. It moved armies. It built navies. It founded cities. It opened hemispheres. It changed the map of the world. And it all began in some fundamental sense with the same question that the woman packing her salt barrel was asking. How do I make this last? But not everyone in medieval Europe had access to Venetian pepper or Genoese cinnamon. Not everyone could afford the luxury end of preservation. And the distance between those who could and those who could not, between the nobleman's spiced and honeyed table and the peasant's simple salted provisions, was not just a gap in flavour. It was a gap in survival probability, a gap in quality of life, a gap that mapped precisely onto the existing hierarchies of medieval society and reinforced them year after year in the most intimate possible way, through food, through what was on the table, through who had enough, and who was always quietly calculating whether they would. That story, the class divide written in food, in preservation methods, in the difference between an ice house and an earthen pit, is exactly where we are headed next. Fan Moy, the class divide on the plate peasant pits versus noble ice houses. Here is a question I want you to sit with for a moment. If you had to bet your family's survival on one thing, one single variable that would most reliably predict whether a medieval household made it through a hard winter with enough to eat, what would you guess? It was geography, climate. The size of the harvest. All of those mattered, but the historians who have spent careers studying medieval food security tend to converge on something more specific, something more uncomfortable. The single most reliable predictor of whether a medieval family survived food scarcity was not where they lived or what the weather did. It was their position in the social hierarchy, not because wealth made people smarter about food preservation, but because wealth gave people access to better techniques, better facilities, better ingredients, and crucially the margin for error that meant a single bad batch or a single failed harvest did not immediately become a catastrophe. Poverty in the medieval food system meant living without margin, and without margin everything was fragile. Let me take you into two different medieval households in the same English county on the same autumn day, in approximately the year 1300. Same region, same climate, same harvest season, two completely different worlds. The first household is a minor nobleman's manor, not extraordinarily wealthy, not a great lord's estate. A modest landholding, a stone manor house, a household of perhaps 30 people including family and servants. In the weeks after the autumn slaughter, this household is managing what amounts to a small-scale food processing operation. Dedicated servants are responsible for salting, others for smoking. The manor's stone undercroft, that cool, dark, vaulted space we discussed in an earlier chapter, is being methodically stocked according to a system that has been refined over generations. The estate steward is keeping records. Not just, we have some salt meat and some dried fish. Specific records. How many barrels of salted pork? How many smoked hams? How many crocks of pickled vegetables? How many bushels of grain in the granary? How many months of provisions at what rate of consumption? The steward can tell you on any given day in January roughly how long the current stores will last at the current rate of use. That is planning. Real systematic documented planning. And if something goes wrong, if a barrel is found to have spoiled, if the grain shows signs of mould, if the smoked meats have not dried properly, this household has enough redundancy in its stores to absorb the loss without crisis. They will eat less of one thing and more of another. They will adjust, but they will not starve. Now come with me to the second household, half a mile away on the edge of the same estate's landholding. A peasant family of 5 parents, 3 children. They are not serfs in the most restricted sense. They have a small holding of their own. They work hard. They are not lazy or careless or ignorant, but they are operating with almost no margin at all. Their preservation infrastructure consists of the following: a small earthen pit dug beneath the floor of their single-room cottage, lined with straw covered with a wooden board. A low fire in the centre of the room that serves simultaneously as their cooking fire, their heating source, and their very modest smoking apparatus for whatever small amounts of meat they can preserve. A few clay crocks of various sizes, some sealed with cloth, and wooden lids, some with whatever wax they could accumulate from their small number of beehives. That is it. No stone undercroft, no dedicated smokehouse, no separate dairy, no estate steward keeping careful records of consumption rates. Just a pit afire and a few crocks. And their entire winter, the survival of 5 people through 4 to 5 months of cold depends on how well those simple tools perform. Now, I want to be fair here because medieval peasants are often portrayed in popular imagination as passive victims of circumstance, and the historical record does not really support that picture. Peasant households were extraordinarily resourceful. They had deep practical knowledge of their specific local environment, which plants could be foraged even in winter, which wild animals might supplement their stored provisions, which neighbours might have surplus of something they lacked and would be willing to trade. Community networks, the informal reciprocal relationships between neighbouring peasant households, were a genuine form of food security that does not show up in estate records, but was enormously important in practice. If one household's salt meat went bad, the neighbours knew. And in a functioning community, that knowledge sometimes translated into informal support, shared resources, shared labour, the kind of mutual aid that does not leave documentary evidence but kept people alive through hard seasons. This is not romanticism. This is documented in the historical sociology of medieval rural communities. People survived not just through individual household preparation, but through community networks that provided backup when individual preparations failed. But the gap in physical infrastructure between the manor and the peasant cottage was real, and it had specific measurable consequences for food safety that I think are worth examining honestly. Consider the question of temperature control in storage. The manor's stone undercroft, built thick-walled partially below grade separate from the main living space, maintained a consistent temperature that was close to optimal for preserved food storage year-round. We talked about this in the chapter on underground storage, roughly 50 degrees Fahrenheit stable across seasons. The peasant's earthen pit beneath the floor of their single heated room. In winter, that room was warmed by the central fire. The floor above the pit was warmer than ideal. In summer, without adequate depth or insulation, the pit might warm beyond safe storage temperatures. The temperature fluctuations that accelerate spoilage and encourage bacterial activity were more extreme for the peasant's storage pit than for the nobleman's vaulted undercroft. Same preservation technique, different infrastructure, meaningfully different outcomes. The icehouse is perhaps the starkest illustration of this divide, because icehouses represent a level of food preservation infrastructure so far beyond what ordinary households could access that they might as well belong to a different civilization. An icehouse was exactly what it sounds like, a dedicated structure usually partially or fully underground heavily insulated, often with thick stone walls, and a domed or vaulted roof specifically designed to store ice. In winter, servants would go to frozen ponds and rivers and cut large blocks of ice with iron tools. This was hard, cold, dangerous work. The ice blocks were then transported by sledge or cart to the ice house, where they were packed in layers of straw for insulation and stored. If the ice house was well designed and well managed, ice harvested in January could survive into July or even August, which meant that wealthy households had access to something almost incomprehensibly luxurious by medieval standards: genuine cold storage in summer. They could keep fresh fish alive in tanks cooled with ice. They could produce chilled drinks for summer feasts. They could slow the spoilage of fresh meat in warm weather in ways that were simply impossible without ice. An English royal household account from the 13th century records the labour costs of ice harvesting and transportation for the royal ice houses. This was a routine annual expenditure, as normal in the planning of a royal household as buying salt or firewood. For the peasant family half a mile away, it was as relevant to their lives as space travel. The quality of salt available to different social classes is another dimension of this divide that tends to get overlooked. We touched on this in the chapter about salt, the distinction between fine, refined white salt for wealthy tables and coarser sea salt for ordinary preservation. But the practical preservation consequences of salt quality went beyond social signalling. Finer, more consistently sized salt crystals distributed more evenly through a cure. Less consistent coarse salt could create pockets of undersalting within a large cut of meat areas, where bacteria could still establish themselves even in an apparently well-salted product. This is not a trivial difference. Uneven salting was one of the most common causes of preserved meat spoilage, even in otherwise competent household operations. Wealthy households could afford the finer salt that cured more reliably. Peasant households used the coarse, cheap salt that was all they could access, and some percentage of their preserved meat failed as a result not through incompetence, but through the physical limitations of the ingredient they had available. There is a detail from the historical record of medieval England that I find particularly striking, because it captures the texture of this inequality in a very specific and human way. Estate records from large English manors in the 13th and 14th centuries document what historians call livery distributions, the regular allocation of food provisions to household servants and workers. These records show in meticulous detail exactly who received what. The steward received better cuts and higher quantities. The kitchen servants received adequate but plainer provisions. The outdoor workers received the minimum, often heavily salted, lower quality cuts, dried legumes, coarse bread, all from the same estate, all from the same preservation system, but distributed according to rank in ways that were considered entirely natural and appropriate. The inequality was not just between the manor and the peasant household outside its walls, it was embedded within the manor itself. Preserved food was rationed by social position even among people living under the same roof. And then there is the question of what happened when the system failed completely. When the harvest was too poor, the winter too long, or the preservation methods inadequate, what happened to people at different levels of the social hierarchy? For noble households, food scarcity meant tightening the belt, eating through reserves more quickly than planned, buying provisions at inflated market prices, reducing distributions to servants, imposing modest restrictions on the household's consumption. Uncomfortable, stressful, but survivable. For peasant households, food scarcity meant something more immediate and more brutal. It meant adults eating less so children could eat more. It meant consuming seed grain that was meant for the next planting season, a decision that solved this winter's hunger while guaranteeing next year's would be worse. It meant foraging for foods that would not normally be considered edible. It meant dependence on the charity of the church, the manor, or the community. And in the worst cases, in the great famines that struck periodically across medieval Europe, when multiple bad harvests coincided with inadequate preservation stores and disrupted trade networks, it meant deaths. Not dramatic documented deaths, quiet deaths. The kind that don't always make it into the historical record. An elderly grandparent who stopped eating so the grandchildren could have more. A family that arrived at spring too weakened by hunger to plant effectively. A community that contracted disease more readily because months of nutritional deprivation had compromised their resilience. I think about this a lot. Not with despair, but with a kind of attentiveness that I hope the history deserves. Because the medieval food preservation story that we usually tell, the clever techniques, the accumulated wisdom, the remarkable ingenuity is a real story. It is genuinely admirable, but it is not the whole story. The whole story includes the unequal distribution of that ingenuity's benefits. It includes the peasant family whose earthen pit could not match the nobleman's stone undercroft through no fault of their own preparation or knowledge. It includes the communities far from salt trade routes managing with inadequate preserving materials and absorbing the consequences in their winter health outcomes. It includes the structural reality that in medieval Europe, as in most human societies before and since, access to the best available technology for survival was unevenly distributed. And the people who most needed reliable food security were often the ones with the least access to the means of achieving it. That is not a comfortable observation, but I think it is an important one, because it reminds us that the history of food preservation is not just a story of human ingenuity, it is also a story of human inequality, of the gap between what was possible and what was accessible, of the distance sometimes measured in half a mile between a manor house and a cottage, between enough and not enough. That gap is part of the story, and the medieval people who lived on either side of it, the steward keeping careful records in the undercroft, the peasant woman checking her earthen pit by candlelight, both of them doing everything they knew how to do to keep their families alive, both deserve to be part of the history we tell. So we have seen the heights of medieval preservation infrastructure, the monastery with its dedicated cellar and vaulted undercrofts, the noble estate with its ice house and its systematic provisions management, the spice routes that connected medieval kitchens to the other side of the world. And we've seen the other end of the spectrum, the peasant's pit, the coarse salt, the earthen pot sealed with whatever cloth and wax was available, and the quiet grinding reality of what happened when any of it wasn't enough. But there is one final dimension of this story that we have not yet confronted directly. The moments when the preservation system didn't just strain or fall short. The moments when it actively catastrophically failed. When the food that was supposed to sustain life did something else entirely. When the barrel that was opened in February contained something that did not just fail to nourish, but actively harmed. When the contamination was invisible. When the damage was done before anyone knew anything was wrong. That chapter, the darkest chapter in this entire story, is exactly where we are headed now. There is something I've been holding back, deliberately, through every chapter of this story, through the elegant salt cellars and the carefully tended smokehouses, through the monastery dairies and the wind-dried stockfish of Norway, through the spice routes and the honey-sealed crocks, and the fermenting barrels humming quietly in the dark. I have been telling you mostly about the things that worked, about the ingenuity, about the accumulated wisdom, about the remarkable, admirable ways that medieval people solved the problem of keeping food alive. And all of that is true. All of it deserves the admiration I have given it. But tonight I want to tell you about the other side, because the other side is real. And in some ways it is more illuminating than the success stories, because you learn the most about any system, any technology, any culture, any set of human practices, not when it works perfectly, but when it breaks. And medieval food preservation broke. sometimes in small ways, sometimes in ways that were merely unpleasant, and sometimes in ways that were genuinely catastrophic. Let me start with something that will probably surprise you because it surprised me the first time I encountered it in the historical record. Medieval people knew. They knew that food could make you ill. They did not have the vocabulary of microbiology or toxicology. They did not know what bacteria were or mold toxins or botulinum or ergot alkaloids. But they had centuries of careful, painful observation, and they had developed through that observation a remarkably sophisticated set of practical guidelines for detecting unsafe food. Medieval household manuals, the kinds of practical domestic guides that survive in various forms from the 13th century onward, contain detailed instructions for assessing the condition of stored foods. The guidance is sensory, entirely sensory. Smell first. If a piece of preserved meat has developed an odour that is wrong, not just strongly salt and smoke, not just aged, but something underneath that, something sour or sweet in a bad way, something that makes you pull back, slightly discard it. Do not taste it to check. Do not cook it, and hope. Discard it. Colour second. Properly preserved meat should hold its colour within expected parameters, dark brown or reddish brown from smoke, grey-pink from salt cure. Unexpected green or black patches at the surface, or grey discoloration that penetrates deeper than the surface layer were warning signs. Texture third. Preserved meat should be firm, dense, consistent, resistant. If it has developed soft spots, or if pressing the surface leaves an impression that does not spring back, something has gone wrong in the preservation process. These are not sophisticated analytical methods, but they are correct. Every single one of these sensory indicators maps directly onto what we now know about the specific types of spoilage and contamination that afflict preserved meats. The wrong smell is volatile compounds produced by bacterial activity. The wrong colour is often the visible evidence of mold or bacterial colonies. The wrong texture is the result of enzymatic breakdown of the meat's protein structure. Medieval people did not know any of that, but they knew the signs. And in general, for visible spoilage, the sensory approach worked reasonably well. The problem was what you could not see, could not smell, could not detect until it was far too late. Botulism. The word comes from the Latin botulus, meaning sausage, because the earliest systematic medical observations of the disease in late 18th century Germany were associated with improperly prepared sausages. But the disease itself is far older than its name. Botulinum toxin, produced by the bacterium Clostridium botulinum, is one of the most acutely toxic substances known to exist in nature, and it flourishes in exactly the conditions that medieval preservation methods created. Anaerobic environments, low oxygen, moderate moisture levels, moderate temperatures, a sealed crock of preserved meat, a tightly packed barrel of brined vegetables, a wax-sealed container of cooked food stored in a warm cellar. These were from the perspective of Clostridium botulinum ideal living conditions. The bacterium produces its toxin quietly and visibly, without dramatically altering the appearance or smell of the food it inhabits. This is the particularly cruel feature of botulism as a food safety hazard. The food can look fine, can smell acceptable, can taste more or less normal, and yet be carrying a toxin that in sufficient quantity causes progressive paralysis and can be fatal. Medieval people had no way to detect this. Their sensory evaluation system, sophisticated and effective as it was for visible spoilage, was simply not equipped to identify a threat that produces no reliable sensory warning. How many deaths in medieval Europe recorded simply as sudden illness or mysterious decline were actually botulism from improperly preserved food we cannot know. The historical record does not give us that level of diagnostic precision, but the answer is almost certainly more than anyone recorded, more than anyone knew. Now I want to talk about something that goes beyond individual households, something that affected entire communities, entire regions, something that turned the very grain that was the foundation of the medieval diet into a source of widespread suffering. Ergotism. If you've not heard of this before, I want you to brace yourself slightly, because the story of ergot in the medieval grain supply is one of the strangest and most disturbing chapters in the entire history of food. Ergot is a fungus, Claviceps purpurea, that infects grain crops, particularly rye, which was the primary bread grain of the poor across much of northern and eastern Europe throughout the medieval period. The fungus replaces the grain kernels with dark elongated structures called sclerotia, hard purple-black bodies that can look to the untrained eye simply like darker or slightly misshapen grain, and those sclerotia contain a complex mixture of alkaloids, powerful bioactive compounds that when consumed by humans produce effects that range from deeply unpleasant to catastrophic. Ergot alkaloids cause vasoconstriction. They squeeze the blood vessels, reducing blood flow to the extremities. In mild cases, this produces a burning sensation in the hands and feet. In severe cases, it produces gangrene. The affected limb darkens, the tissue dies. In the worst documented historical cases, fingers, hands, feet, or entire limbs would blacken and eventually separate from the body while the person was still alive. This form of ergotism was known in medieval Europe as St. Anthony's fire, a name that tells you something important about how people experienced and interpreted it. The burning sensation, the sensation of fire in the extremities, the desperate pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Anthony of Padua, patron of those suffering from this affliction, in hope of divine intervention. What they needed was not divine intervention. What they needed was to stop eating the contaminated grain. But they did not know the grain was contaminated. It looked like grain. It tasted like grain. It was grain, mostly just with some dark bits mixed in that nobody knew to separate out. There is a second form of ergotism, perhaps even more disturbing, that affected the nervous system rather than the vascular system: convulsive ergotism. The alkaloids in ergot, when they affect the central nervous system, can produce symptoms that medieval observers and honestly anyone without modern medical knowledge would struggle to interpret as anything other than supernatural. Convulsions, hallucinations, wild, uncontrollable movements, a sensation of things crawling under the skin, psychosis. In communities where a contaminated grain supply was widely consumed, these symptoms could appear simultaneously in dozens or hundreds of people. An entire village or an entire district experiencing collective hallucinations and convulsive episodes. Screaming, writhing, seeing things that were not there. You can imagine what medieval observers made of this. You can imagine the theological interpretations, the accusations, the fear. Some historians, and this is genuinely contested, I want to be clear about that, have suggested that certain historical episodes of mass hysteria, collective affliction, and accusations of witchcraft in medieval and early modern Europe may have been, at least in part, episodes of convulsive ergotism affecting grain-dependent communities. The connection is not proven, but it is not dismissible. And when I sit with that possibility, when I think about communities destroyed by fear and accusation that may have originated in a contaminated rye harvest, the weight of what imperfect food preservation could cost becomes almost unbearable. The question of why ergot contamination was so persistent in medieval grain supplies is worth understanding, because the answer reveals something important about the structural vulnerabilities of medieval food systems. Ergot thrives in specific conditions, cool, damp weather during the flowering stage of grain development. Northern Europe, England, northern France, Germany, Scandinavia, Poland experienced these conditions regularly. The wet springs and cool summers that were common across the medieval period were from the fungus's perspective ideal, and the grain processing methods available to most medieval communities were not equipped to remove it. Proper cleaning of harvested grain, winnowing, sieving, hand-picking could reduce ergot contamination but rarely eliminated it. The dark sclerotia, while distinctive to a trained eye, could be missed easily in the chaos of a harvest, in the dim light of a barn by exhausted workers trying to process as much grain as quickly as possible before the weather turned. And once the contaminated grain was stored and ground into flour, the ergot alkaloids were distributed throughout the batch. There was no recovering it. There was no way with medieval technology to test the flour and know you made the bread, you ate the bread, and then you waited to see what the bread did to you. That is a profoundly unsettling relationship with your most basic food, and yet medieval communities lived with it not because they were fatalistic or ignorant, but because they had no alternative. There is another failure mode in medieval food preservation that I think deserves honest attention, and that is the failure that came from the containers themselves. Lead. Medieval Europe used lead in ways that we now find alarming. Lead-lined vessels for cooking and storage. Lead-glazed pottery. Lead-based sweetening agents, most notoriously the Roman-era practice of using lead acetate as a sweetener, a practice that lingered in certain forms into early medieval cooking. Lead is a neurotoxin. Chronic exposure, not a single dramatic dose, but low-level continuous consumption through food and drink that had been stored in or prepared in lead-containing vessels, causes progressive neurological damage, cognitive impairment, behavioral changes, in severe cases physical disability and early death. We now have reasonable evidence that lead contamination was a significant chronic health problem in certain segments of medieval society, particularly somewhat ironically among the wealthy, who were more likely to use high-quality lead-glazed pottery and metal vessels. The finest pewter, a tin-lead alloy, was a status symbol. Serving wine in pewter was elegant, and the acidic wine was quietly leaching lead into itself every time it sat in that elegant pewter vessel. The poor eating from wooden bowls and drinking from clay pots fired without lead glaze were in some ways accidentally better protected. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because they could not afford the thing that was making the wealthy sick. And then there were the market failures. Because medieval food safety was not purely a private household matter, it was also a commercial one. And wherever commercial food trade exists, the temptation to sell substandard or adulterated product exists alongside it. Medieval urban authorities were from the 12th and 13th centuries onward increasingly aware of this problem, and they responded to it with legislation. In 13th century Paris, one of the largest and most commercially active cities in medieval Europe, with a food market infrastructure of considerable complexity, municipal regulations governing the sale of food were detailed and actively enforced. Butchers found selling meat that had spoiled or been misrepresented could face significant fines. Persistent offenders could be expelled from the guild, which effectively meant losing the right to trade in the city. In some documented cases, the punishment was more theatrical. A seller of rotten fish might be required to carry the offending fish through the streets, while passers-by were encouraged to be vocal about their opinion of both the fish and the seller. Medieval justice was nothing if not public. The assize of bread, a piece of English legislation that goes back to the 13th century and was enforced continuously for several hundred years, regulated not just the price of bread relative to the price of grain, but its weight and quality. A baker who consistently sold underweight loaves was subject to a penalty that has honestly a kind of poetic appropriateness. The loaf was tied around the baker's neck, and they were dragged through the streets on a hurdle, I'm not suggesting we revive this particular enforcement mechanism, but I do find something satisfying about the underlying principle. Your food, your responsibility. What I want to leave you with from this darker chapter of the story is not despair, it is perspective. Medieval people were not reckless with their food. They were not indifferent to the risks. They developed sensory evaluation systems, quality control regulations, institutional practices and cultural guidelines, all aimed at minimizing the dangers of a food preservation technology that was by its nature imperfect. They succeeded imperfectly but significantly in feeding populations through conditions that should, by rights, have been catastrophic, far more often than they were, and the failures, the ergotism, the botulism, the lead contamination, the market fraud, were not signs of ignorance. They were the visible edges of a knowledge frontier, the places where human understanding had not yet reached. Every generation pushed that frontier a little further forward, observed a little more carefully, recorded what they noticed, passed it forward. Until eventually, slowly, painfully across centuries, the cumulative knowledge became sufficient to address what the previous generation could only suffer through. That is how human progress actually works, not in sudden revolutions, in patient, incremental, often invisible accumulation. One bad batch of rye, one contaminated crock, one observant monk who noticed that this particular storage method produced worse outcomes than that one careful household manager who wrote down what she had learned so that her daughter would not have to learn it the same way she had, step by step, generation by generation, pushing the darkness back. And that brings us finally to the last chapter of this story, the one I have been building toward from the very beginning. Because everything we have talked about, the salt and the smoke, the cellars and the fermentation, the monasteries and the spice trade, the successes and the failures, all of it leads somewhere. All of it has a legacy. And that legacy is not just historical. It is sitting in your kitchen right now. It is in the jar of pickles in your refrigerator. It is in the sourdough starter on someone's counter. It is in the aged cheese on your cutting board. It is in the smoked salmon on your plate. And the question I want to end with, the question that has been underneath this entire series, is this. What did we lose when we stopped needing all of this? And is it too late to get some of it back? That conversation, the most personal, the most contemporary, the most directly relevant to the world we actually live in, is what we are stepping into right now. Something happened to me a few years ago that I have been thinking about ever since. I was visiting an older relative, someone in her late 80s, sharp as ever, still cooking her own meals, still managing her own kitchen with a quiet authority that I found honestly a little intimidating. And I noticed on a shelf in her pantry a row of ceramic crocks, heavy dark, sealed with cloth and weighted lids. I asked her what was in them. She looked at me the way you look at someone who has just asked a slightly foolish question, and she said very simply, food, fermented vegetables, cured pork fat rubbed with salt and herbs, dried mushrooms packed in coarse salt, a jar of something dark and intensely fragrant that turned out to be preserved plums in their own concentrated juice. She had learned all of it from her mother, who had learned it from hers. And when I asked her why she still did it, this woman with a perfectly functional modern refrigerator 6 feet away, she thought about it for a moment, and then said something that has stayed with me ever since. Because the refrigerator keeps things the same, this makes them better. I have been thinking about that sentence throughout this entire series. The refrigerator keeps things the same, this makes them better. And I think in those 7 words she accidentally summarized one of the most important things we have lost in the transition from medieval preservation to modern refrigeration. Not the safety, not the reliability, not the convenience, all of which are genuine, significant improvements that I have no desire to romanticize away. But the transformation, the alchemical quality of medieval preservation, The way that salt and smoke and fermentation and time did not merely pause food in its current state, but actively changed it into something new, something deeper, something with a complexity and a depth of flavor that the original ingredients simply did not possess that quality, is the thing we gave up. When we put something in a refrigerator, we are pressing pause. When medieval people preserved something, they were beginning a conversation, a long, slow, patient conversation between the food and its environment. And the food that came out of that conversation months later was not the same food that went in. It was more itself somehow, more concentrated, more fully realized. Let me give you some numbers that I think bring the scale of what we have lost into focus. In 1900, the United States had roughly 1,500 distinct varieties of apple being commercially grown and sold. By the 1980s, that number had collapsed to fewer than 90. Today, the vast majority of apples sold in American supermarkets are drawn from fewer than 15 varieties. Now, why does this matter in a story about medieval food preservation? Because the apple varieties that survived into the modern commercial era were selected almost entirely for one quality: the ability to survive refrigerated storage and long-distance transport without visible deterioration, appearance, shelf life, structural integrity. The varieties that were lost, the majority of those 1,500 kinds, were often selected by the communities that grew and loved them for centuries for entirely different qualities: flavor, complexity, the particular behavior they showed when cooked dried, fermented into cider, or preserved in honey. The Roxbury russet, one of the oldest American apple varieties documented from colonial Massachusetts in the 17th century, is almost impossible to find today. It is not beautiful by modern supermarket standards. Its skin is rough and russeted dull gold and brown. It does not photograph well, but it dries extraordinarily well. It makes remarkable cider. It keeps in a root cellar for months, and its flavor eaten fresh is complex in a way that a Honeycrisp simply is not. It was preserved in the culinary sense by the communities that grew it, not because it was convenient, but because it was extraordinary. And we lost it. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just gradually, quietly, as each generation chose the easier option over the more demanding one. As refrigeration made it possible to stop thinking about preservation entirely. As the knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries became unnecessary and therefore untaught and therefore forgotten. Now, I want to be careful here because I am not making a simple argument that the old ways were better and we should all go back to them. I do not actually believe that. I believe that refrigeration canning, vacuum sealing, and modern food preservation technology have saved an enormous number of lives and reduced an enormous amount of suffering. The botulism we talked about in the previous chapter, the ergotism, the chronic low-level food insecurity that characterized life for most medieval people, the constant calculation, the anxiety about whether the cellar would hold until spring. I would not wish any of that back. But I also think there is something genuinely worth mourning in what the transition cost us. And more importantly, more practically, I think there is something worth recovering. Not all of it. Not the suffering, but the knowledge, the relationship, the understanding of what food actually is and what it can become when you work with it rather than simply storing it. Here is what gives me real hope. The past 2 decades have seen something remarkable happening in kitchens and farmers' markets and small-scale food production operations across America and Europe. A quiet, steady, determined revival of almost every preservation technique we've talked about in this series. Fermentation has exploded. In 2003, there were perhaps a handful of books in print in the English language specifically dedicated to home fermentation. By 2020, that number had grown to hundreds. The work of writers like Sandor Katz, who has spent decades documenting and reviving traditional fermentation practices from cultures around the world, has introduced a new generation to the idea that the microbial transformation of food is not something to be avoided or sterilized away, but something to be cultivated and celebrated. Kombucha, kimchi, kefir, miso, naturally fermented pickles, sourdough. These are no longer niche products found only in specialty stores. They're in mainstream supermarkets. They're on restaurant menus. They're in home kitchens across the country. People are keeping sourdough starters again. Living starters. Fed daily. Treated with care. And if you look at the Instagram accounts and the YouTube channels and the home baking communities dedicated to this practice, you will notice something interesting. People are not doing it just because sourdough bread is delicious. They are doing it because of what it means to maintain something living, to be responsible for a culture that depends on your attention, to participate however modestly in a chain of continuity that reaches back through centuries. That is not a practical motivation. That is a human one. The artisan cheesemaking revival tells a similar story. In 1970, the United States had fewer than 100 small-scale artisan cheesemakers. By 2020, that number had grown to over 900. People are learning to make cave-age cheese again, to cultivate specific mold cultures, to manage the temperature and humidity of aging rooms with the same careful attention that medieval monastery cellars gave to their stone vaults. And in Europe, the movement to protect traditional preserved foods through geographical indication status, the designations that protect things like prosciutto di Parma, Parmigiano, Reggiano Comté, and hundreds of other regionally specific preserved foods, reflects a recognition that these products represent not just flavor, but cultural heritage, living connections to the preservation knowledge of the past, techniques that took centuries to develop encoded in specific practices in specific places still being carried forward by people who understand what would be lost if they stopped. The cold smoking revival is perhaps the most personal example for me. Because cold smoking, the traditional method of smoking food at low temperatures below 80 degrees Fahrenheit for extended periods, was the dominant smoking technique for most of medieval European food preservation history. It produces a different result from the hot smoking that most modern commercial smokers use, more subtle, less cooked, a deeper penetration of smoke flavor with less alteration of the food's original texture, and it requires patience in a way that modern techniques do not. Cold smoking a side of salmon properly takes 12 to 24 hours of careful temperature management. You cannot rush it. You cannot set a timer and walk away. You have to be present, attentive, responsive. The fire needs tending, and I think that is exactly why, for a growing number of people, it is compelling again, not despite its demands, because of them. There is something about a process that requires your presence and your attention that cannot be automated, cannot be delegated to a machine, cannot be completed faster than it chooses to be completed, that feels in a world of instant everything almost revolutionary. But here is what I think is the deepest lesson that medieval food preservation has to teach us, and it is a lesson that goes beyond food. Medieval preservation worked when it worked, because people paid attention to the details that mattered. They learned which combinations of techniques were more reliable than single methods alone. They built redundancy into their systems, never depending on any single preservation method to be their only defense against hunger. They developed knowledge through careful observation and were willing to be wrong and to adjust. They transmitted what they learned imperfectly but persistently across generations. And they accepted the fundamental truth that they were operating in a complex natural system that did not always cooperate with human plans and that required ongoing engagement rather than a one-time solution. None of that is specifically about food. All of it is about how to navigate a world that is genuinely uncertain, how to prepare for futures you cannot see, how to build resilience in the face of systems you do not fully control. The medieval peasant who packed a root cellar in October who maintained her sourdough starter, who hung her herbs in the right conditions at the right time of year, she was practicing in the most concrete possible terms a philosophy of engaged, attentive, redundant preparedness. She did not have a word for it. She just did it. Because her mother had done it, and because if she did not do it, the consequences were entirely real. I want to leave you with one image, not a grand historical scene, not a castle or a monastery or a Norse fishing boat, something smaller, a jar, a simple glass jar sitting on a kitchen counter somewhere in America right now. Inside it, bubbling very gently, is a sourdough starter. Someone is feeding it tonight a spoonful of flour, a little water, stirring it carefully before putting the cloth back over the top. Maybe they know that what they're doing connects them through an unbroken chain of daily feedings to every baker who ever coaxed wild yeast out of the air and used it to make bread rise. Maybe they do not know. Maybe they just know that it makes bread that their family loves, that the process calms them, that there is something deeply satisfying about tending something alive. But the connection is real regardless of whether they know it. The yeast in that jar descends not directly, not in a linear genealogy, but through the accumulated tradition of a practice carried forward from the same wild cultures that medieval bakers worked with in the 11th and 12th and 13th centuries. The flour and water and wild yeast have not changed. The fundamental chemistry has not changed. The patience required has not changed. What we almost lost and are slowly gratefully recovering is simply the willingness to engage with it, to show up, to feed the starter, to salt the meat, to wait, to trust that the process followed carefully and with attention will produce something worth having, something that could not have been made any faster, something that required exactly the time it took. That is the story of medieval food preservation. Not just a story about barrels and cellars and smoke, a story about the relationship between human beings and the natural world they depended on, a story about the accumulation and transmission of knowledge across generations, a story about ingenuity and failure and resilience and the particular kind of hope that requires work, a story that is in the most unexpected and wonderful way still being written, in your kitchen, in mine, in every jar of fermenting vegetables, every wheel of aging cheese, every bundle of dried herbs hanging in a cool shed somewhere. The medieval kitchen never entirely closed. It just got quieter for a while, and now it seems it is waking back up. Thank you. Genuinely. If you have made it this far, if you have spent this time with me moving through this long winding, occasionally surprising story of salt and smoke and cold stone and living cultures, then thank you for your company. This is exactly the kind of journey I love to take with you. The kind where we start with something that seems simple, just food, just keeping things from going bad, and end up somewhere much larger. Somewhere that touches economics and religion and science and class and identity, and the long, slow, magnificent arc of human learning. That is what history does when you give it enough time and enough attention. It stops being facts and dates and names, and it becomes something alive. Something that, like a good sourdough starter, keeps feeding itself as long as you pay attention to it. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think differently about something in your kitchen, or about the people who came before us, or about the knowledge we carry without always knowing we carry it, I would genuinely love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what surprised you. Tell me what you want to know more about. Tell me if there is a jar of something fermenting on your counter tonight. Because I read your comments, every one of them. And your curiosity, your real generous open curiosity about how the world works and how it got this way, is what makes these stories worth telling. Subscribe if you have not already, not for the algorithm, for yourself. Because the next story we're going to tell together is already waiting, and I promise you it begins somewhere you would not expect, with a question that sounds almost too simple to be interesting. and end somewhere that will stay with you for a very long time. I will see you there. Sleep well.